Hey there, tonight we're diving into the world of the Medici family, where the truth is, they wielded more power with their checkbooks than their crowns, ushering in the Renaissance one lavish commission at a time. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. Giovanni di Bixi de Medici may not have had the swagger of a rock star, but he sure knew how to rock the world of finance. Picture this, a man with the knack for numbers and enough ambition to rival a startup founder. Giovanni wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Nope, just the usual wooden one. He started out in the late 14th century as a humble banker in Florence, a city that was less about rolling green hills and more about cutthroat politics and economic hustling. Giovanni's story kicks off in 1360, and by 1397 he'd already set up the Medici Bank. Now, if you're thinking of a bank as a place with marble floors and a coffee machine that never works, think again. Giovanni's bank was more akin to a high-stakes poker game where the richest families of Florence were the players. With a sharp eye for opportunity and a nose for profit, Giovanni turned the Medici Bank into a financial powerhouse. By the time he was done, it was the Amazon of the Renaissance, minus the 2-day shipping. Now, if you've ever wondered how a banker could start a dynasty that would eventually produce popes and queens, here's a hint. Follow the money. Giovanni's financial wizardry didn't just keep the Medici coffers full. It also bought political influence. He was like the Elon Musk of his day, only with fewer tweets and more florins. Giovanni's bank became the official bank of the Papal States in 1410, which was kind of a big deal. Imagine being the preferred banker of the Vatican. Talk about having friends in high places. But let's not get too romantic here. The Medici Bank wasn't just about honest bookkeeping and earning interest. Giovanni was a master of the double-entry bookkeeping system, a revolutionary method at the time, which allowed him to keep track of debits and credits with the precision of a Swiss watch. This wasn't just about balancing the books. It was about creating a financial empire that could withstand the wild roller coaster of 15th century economics. Let's not pretend the Medici family was all sunshine and philanthropy. Sure, they funded the Renaissance, the art, the architecture, the science, but their rise to power wasn't exactly a Disney movie. Giovanni's banking success allowed him to marry into powerful families, ally with key political figures, and essentially buy his way into the upper echelons of Florentine society. Money may not buy happiness, but it sure as hell buys influence, and Giovanni knew exactly how to spend. By the time Giovanni died in 1429, he had amassed a fortune of 180,000 florins. To put that in perspective, a skilled worker in Florence at the time might earn about 30 florins a year. So yeah, Giovanni was comfortably sitting atop a mountain of gold by the standards of his day. His financial savvy laid the foundation for what would become one of the most powerful families in Europe. He may not have lived to see the full reach of his dynasty, but he set the stage for the Medici to become the ultimate power players. So, while Giovanni di Bixi de Medici might not have been a household name like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, his impact was just as profound. He was the quiet architect of Florence's golden age, a man who understood that true power lies not just in wealth, but in the ability to wield it. Giovanni's legacy was built on more than just coin. It was built on the cunning use of that coin to shape the future of an entire continent. As the founding father of the Medici Bank, he kickstarted a dynasty that would be more influential than any modern-day tech giant could dream of. And that, my friends, is how a small-time banker turned into the godfather of the Renaissance. Giovanni might not have painted the Mona Lisa or sculpted David, but without his financial backing, none of those masterpieces would have seen the light of day. Ah, Giovanni di Bixi de Medici, master of florins and father of financial finesse. But let's not forget his progeny, the one who truly turned the Medici name into a political juggernaut, Cosimo de Medici. If Giovanni was the Elon Musk of his time, Cosimo was the Jeff Bezos, quiet, calculating, not afraid to shake things up. Born in 1389, Cosimo wasn't just handed the keys to the Medici Bank. He expanded the family business into a multi-city empire while reshaping the cultural landscape of Florence. Talk about multitasking. Cosimo's genius lay not just in his ability to make money, but in how he used it. Forget about buying yachts or building skyscrapers. This guy invested in people, specifically the artists and thinkers who would light up the Renaissance like a Christmas tree. Take Brunelleschi, for instance. He was the architect behind the breathtaking dome of the Florence Cathedral, a project that was as mind-boggling then as SpaceX launching a Tesla into orbit is today. Cosimo didn't just fund Brunelleschi's vision. He stood behind it like a proud parent at a science fair, ensuring that the Medici name was etched into every brick. Then there was Donatello, the sculptor who made marble sing. His bronze David was a game-changer, a piece that combined classical beauty with a playful twist, and who was behind the curtain, pulling the strings and providing the funds. You guessed it, Cosimo. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking this was all about art for art's sake. Cosimo was no naive benefactor. He understood that by backing these revolutionary artists, he was cementing his family's influence in a city where power was as fleeting as a Snapchat story. Cosimo's political prowess made him an enigmatic figure. Known as Pater Patrii, or Father of the Fatherland, he was the puppet master of Florentine politics, a role he played with the skill of a seasoned chess grandmaster. Unlike some who flaunt their power like a new sports car, Cosimo preferred to operate from the shadows. He was the quintessential behind-the-scenes operator, pulling levers and making allies without ever stepping into the limelight. In 1434, when he returned from exile, because yes, even he faced political turbulence, his re-entry into Florence was nothing short of a triumphant homecoming. It was as if the city had been holding its breath, waiting for its prodigal son to restore order. Yet, let's not paint Cosimo as a saint. The Medici weren't the benevolent guardians of Florence. They were its power-hungry overlords. Cosimo's political maneuvering often meant playing dirty. He wasn't above manipulating elections or using his vast wealth to sway decisions in his favor. Think of him as the original influencer, long before Instagram made it cool. His network of spies and informants was the envy of any modern-day intelligence agency, ensuring he stayed one step ahead of rivals. And rivals he had, in spades. Yet despite the Machiavellian machinations, Cosimo had a knack for balancing power and patronage. His investments in the arts weren't just vanity projects. They were strategic moves that bolstered his image as a cultural icon. Florence, under his watch, became a hub of creativity, attracting geniuses like bees to honey. And it wasn't just sculpture and painting that flourished. Cosimo established the Platonic Academy, a gathering of the brightest philosophical minds, aiming to revive the ancient wisdom of Plato. Imagine a TED talk on steroids, with discussions that shaped the intellectual fabric of the era. Cosimo's contributions went beyond art and philosophy. He managed to keep Florence relatively stable during his reign, a feat considering the city's penchant for political upheaval. By strategically marrying off family members and forging alliances, he ensured the Medici grip on power remained steadfast. But let's be real, Cosimo wasn't just playing matchmaker for love. These unions were calculated moves on the political chessboard, each designed to fortify the Medici dynasty's position. Despite his success, Cosimo was acutely aware of the fragility of power. He knew that one misstep could send the Medici tower tumbling down like a house of cards. Perhaps this awareness is what tempered his rule with a touch of humility, an odd trait for a man at the apex of power. He was known to be frugal at times, almost Spartan in his personal life, as if to remind himself of the thin line between triumph and ruin. And so, Cosimo de' Medici, with his unassuming demeanor and shrewd political acumen, laid the groundwork for a dynasty that would endure for centuries. He turned Florence into a beacon of the Renaissance, a city that drew artists, thinkers, and power brokers like moths to a flame. Underneath the marble statues and frescoed walls lay the true legacy of Cosimo, a city sculpted not just by stone and brush, but by the deft hands of a master strategist who understood the true currency of power. As Florence flourished, so too did the Medici influence, spreading across Italy and eventually the world. And while Cosimo's story may end here, the saga of the Medici was far from over. This was just the opening act of a drama that would captivate Europe for generations. Stay tuned, because the plot is about to thicken. As the Medici saga continued, the spotlight shifted to Lorenzo de Medici, the man who could charm a snake out of its skin while dazzling Renaissance Florence with his flair for the dramatic. Lorenzo wasn't just another cog in the Medici machine. He was the showman who turned politics into performance art. Born in 1449, by the tender age of 20, he had already taken the reins of the family dynasty. And boy, did he know how to ride that horse. Lorenzo, or Lorenzo the Magnificent, if you're feeling formal, was the Renaissance's answer to a rock star. Think Mick Jagger with a penchant for patronizing artists instead of strutting stages. He could throw a party that would make Gatsby jealous, and his network of artists, poets, and thinkers was the who's who of the 15th century. If you were a struggling artist, just getting a nod from Lorenzo was like being retweeted by Beyoncé. He didn't just fund the arts. He curated a cultural revolution, supporting talents like Botticelli, who painted The Birth of Venus, and Michelangelo, the kid genius who would later carve David. Lorenzo's patronage was no charity. It was a strategic investment in Florence's and his own legacy. But Lorenzo wasn't just about pretty pictures and grand sculptures. He was the puppet master of Florentine politics, a game he played with the finesse of a seasoned poker player who always knew when to hold em and when to fold em. Florence was a city-state perpetually on the brink of chaos, and Lorenzo walked its tightrope with unmatched grace. His political acumen was legendary. He wielded power like a maestro conducting an orchestra, ensuring the Medici influence remained the dominant note. Now, let's talk about the Pazzi conspiracy, because every great story needs a villain, or in this case, a whole troop of them. In 1478, the Pazzi family, Florence's answer to the Montagues of Shakespearean fame, decided they wanted a slice of the Medici pie. And by slice, I mean the whole damn bakery. The Pazzi conspiracy was a plot straight out of a medieval thriller. On April 26, during Mass at the Florence Cathedral, they attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. Giuliano was fatally stabbed. Tragic, yes. But Lorenzo, ever the survivor, managed a dramatic escape, barricading himself in the sacristy until the chaos subsided. It was a scene that could rival any Hollywood blockbuster, complete with betrayal, bloodshed, and a gutsy hero who lived to fight another day. The aftermath of the conspiracy was as brutal as a Game of Thrones episode. Heads rolled, literally. Lorenzo's calculated vengeance was swift and merciless. The conspirators were hunted down, and those captured were executed with a zeal that would make the Spanish Inquisition blush. It was Lorenzo's way of saying, mess with the Medici, and you'll regret it. This brutal crackdown not only secured his power, but also solidified the Medici's control over Florence, proving that even in the face of treachery, Lorenzo would not be dethroned. Yet Lorenzo wasn't just a ruthless ruler, he was a savvy diplomat. When Pope Sixtus Roman IV, who had more than a passing interest in the Pazzi plot, talk about divine irony, imposed economic sanctions on Florence, Lorenzo didn't just sit back and sulk. Oh no, he sailed to Naples and charmed King Ferrante into siding with him, effectively neutralizing the papal threat. It was diplomacy at its finest, a masterclass in turning potential disaster into a power play. Lorenzo's legacy wasn't just carved in marble or painted on canvas. It was etched into the very fabric of Florentine society. He was a man who understood that true power wasn't just about controlling wealth or wielding influence. It was about shaping culture and ideas. Under his patronage, the Renaissance reached its peak, a cultural explosion that forever changed the landscape of Europe. He turned Florence into a beacon of art, philosophy, and humanism, a place where brilliance wasn't just welcomed, it was expected. But let's not put Lorenzo on too high a pedestal. The Medici may have been patrons of the arts, but their rule was far from benign. They were political puppeteers, their strings pulling the city's fate in whichever direction best suited their interests. Lorenzo's charm and cunning masked the harsh reality of Medici dominance, a rule that, while gilded with artistic achievement, was also underwritten by economic manipulation and political intrigue. The Medici grip on Florence was akin to a velvet glove concealing an iron fist, a dynasty that knew how to dazzle with one hand while deftly maneuvering power with the other. Lorenzo's ability to balance these dualities was the secret sauce that kept the Medici at the top of the Florentine food chain. He was a man who could inspire love and fear in equal measure, a ruler who understood that charisma was as potent a weapon as any sword. As we move forward in this tale, remember, the Medici story isn't just about art and culture. It's about the raw, unvarnished pursuit of power, the kind that shapes nations and forges empires. Lorenzo de' Medici was more than a patron. He was a kingmaker, a man who understood that the true legacy of the Medici wasn't just in what they built, but in how they wielded influence to shape the course of history. So, stay tuned, because this saga is far from over, and the next chapter promises even more twists and turns. And just like that, the Medici saga hit its first major speed bump. Lorenzo de' Medici, the maestro of Renaissance Florence, left behind not just a cultural legacy, but also a precarious political landscape. Enter his son, Piero de' Medici, whose idea of ruling was more akin to throwing parties than orchestrating power plays. Picture it, a young man handed the reins of a city that was a bubbling cauldron of art, politics, and intrigue, and what does he do? He decides to stir it with a cocktail shaker. Piero, often dubbed Piero the Unfortunate, wasn't exactly cut from the same cloth as his illustrious father. If Lorenzo was the Renaissance's rock star, Piero was more like a one-hit wonder. He inherited the Medici mantle in 1492, a year that should have been his golden ticket. Instead, it turned into a one-way trip to chaos. Under his watch, the Medici bank started to wobble, and Florence's political alliances became as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Now, let's talk about the French. In 1494, Charles Romanate of France decided he wanted a slice of the Italian pie, and Florence was right on his path. Instead of channeling his father's diplomatic finesse, Piero chose to roll out the red carpet for Charles, handing over key Florentine territories faster than you can say, bad decision. This move didn't just irk the Florentines, it sent them into a full-blown fury. Imagine a city that once danced to the Medici tune, now turning against them like a jilted lover. Piero's decision-making was about as popular as a tax increase, and before he knew it, he was booted out of Florence in a stunning act of collective civic shrugging. So there you have it. The Medici, once the untouchable titans of Florence, found themselves ousted, exiled, and licking their wounds. It was like watching your favorite soap opera character get written out in a surprise twist. But wait, this is the Medici we're talking about, the family that practically invented the dramatic comeback. Their exile didn't spell the end. It set the stage for one of the greatest returns in history. Let's pause to appreciate the irony here. The Medici, known for their ability to play the long game, were now on the outside looking in. But they weren't sulking in the shadows. They were plotting. The family scurried to the safety of the Papal States, where they had more friends than a reality TV star at premiere. It was there that they regrouped, re-strategized, and prepared for the ultimate revenge tour. Meanwhile, Florence was having a grand old time without the Medici. Savonarola, the fiery preacher with the charisma of a cult leader and the zeal of an apocalypse prophet, took center stage. He whipped up a frenzy of religious fervor that saw Florentines tossing their worldly goods onto bonfires, famously called the bonfire of the vanities. Picture the Renaissance version of a Marie Kondo purge, only with more fire and less joy. The city was a powder keg of puritanical reform, and for a moment it seemed like the Medici's era was well and truly over. But in a plot twist that would make Shakespeare proud, the Medici made their move in 1512, with the help of papal troops and a few well-placed bribes. Because why waste a good opportunity? The family stormed back into Florence. It was a comeback that would make even the most jaded sports fan cheer. The Medici were like the ultimate reality TV villains, returning to reclaim their throne with a flourish. Yet the return wasn't all roses and applause. The Medici had to navigate a Florence that was as fickle as a social media influencer's fanbase. They installed Giulio de' Medici, later Pope Clement Roman VII, as a figurehead, hoping to stabilize their grip on power. But as we all know, power in Florence was slippery, and the Medici were soon embroiled in more conspiracies, betrayals, and political plots than an episode of House of Cards. The Medici's second act was a testament to their resilience and adaptability. They understood that in the game of power, you either evolve or become extinct, Their ability to bounce back from the brink of oblivion was nothing short of remarkable. They were the original comeback kids, proving that even when you're down, you're never truly out as long as you have the right mix of cunning, charm, and, let's be honest, cash. But let's not sugarcoat it. The Medici's return wasn't exactly a fairy tale ending. It was more like a cautionary tale about the perils of power and the lengths one would go to reclaim it. They were back, yes, but the city they returned to was different, and so were they. The Medici had to adapt to a new political landscape, one that was less forgiving and more volatile. Their story became a cycle of ups and downs, a testament to the adage that in politics, as in life, the only constant is change. As we look ahead, remember, the Medici saga is far from finished. This is a family that thrives on drama and reinvention. They may have stumbled, but they've never stayed down for long. The Medici's tale is as much about the art of survival as it is about the art of the Renaissance. And as we prepare for the next chapter, brace yourselves for more twists, more turns, and more of the audacious brilliance that only the Medici can deliver. Stay tuned because the best is yet to come. And so, the Medici story, like a well-crafted fresco, reveals its layers. As they clawed their way back into Florence, they weren't just restoring a dynasty. They were setting the stage for a legacy that would ripple through the ages. Fast forward to today, and it's hard to walk through a European art gallery or read about banking without bumping into the Medici. Their fingerprints are everywhere, like a Renaissance Sierra Zelig, morphing into whatever the times required. Now, let's dive into the art game, where the Medici really strutted their stuff. While it's easy to picture them as Renaissance sugar daddies, doling out florins to any artist with a paintbrush, there was more to it. Their patronage was a strategic chess move, a way to cement their name in history while ensuring Florence's cultural dominance. We're talking about a family that bankrolled everyone from Leonardo da Vinci to Galileo. Leonardo, with his penchant for inventing things and never finishing them, might have been a risky investment for lesser patrons. But the Medici saw his genius, lending him the support to create works like The Last Supper, which, spoiler alert, is still a pretty big deal. But let's not gloss over the economics. Patronage wasn't just philanthropy, it was a power play. By investing in the arts, the Medici turned Florence into a magnet for talent, a city where creativity was the currency of power. The return on investment, immortality, because while money fades, art endures, and we've all seen how that played out. Florence became the epicenter of the Renaissance, a veritable cultural stock exchange where the Medici held the majority shares. Meanwhile, their influence wasn't confined to gilded frames and marble statues. The Medici were the ultimate political operators, playing the long game like a masterful poker player. They didn't just rule Florence, they had their fingers in every pie across Europe. The family produced 4 popes, Leo X, Clement Roman VII, Pius Roman IV, and Leo Roman XI, each using the papal throne as a springboard for Medici interests. Leo X, for instance, was notorious for his lavish spending and patronage of the arts, but he also played a crucial role in the political machinations of Europe, navigating the turbulent waters of the Reformation with a mix of charm and ruthlessness. And here's where the myth and reality collide. The Medici are often romanticized as benevolent rulers and cultural heroes, but they were also the epitome of political ruthlessness. Their rule was a tightrope act of diplomacy and despotism, ensuring that Florence remained both a beacon of art and a stronghold of power. They mastered the art of diplomacy, using marriages like strategic chess moves to cement alliances and secure their position. Their matrimonial web stretched across Europe, ensuring they were never far from the seat of power, whether through blood or influence. Of course, their financial legacy is nothing to sneeze at. The Medici Bank, once the Amazon of its time, pioneered modern banking practices. Giovanni di Bixi de' Medici wasn't just running a bank. He was laying the foundation for the financial systems we recognize today. His use of the double-entry bookkeeping system was revolutionary, allowing for unprecedented financial clarity and control. It was this financial acumen that enabled the Medici to fund their vast network of artists and politicians, keeping the family at the center of European affairs. The Medici weren't just financial wizards, they were the original brand managers. When the bank eventually faltered, thanks to a mix of risky loans and political turbulence, it was the Medici name, not the balance sheet, that carried them through. They understood that reputation was a currency all its own. Even as the bank's fortunes waned, the Medici influence endured, a testament to their understanding that real power transcends mere wealth. But let's not pretend their story was all about high culture and high finance. The Medici were as adept at wielding the sword as they were at handling a paintbrush. Their rule was marked by as much bloodshed as beauty, a reminder that behind the facade of artistic patronage lay a family that was as cunning as they were cultured. They navigated the treacherous waters of Florentine politics with a mix of charisma and coercion, ensuring their legacy was as enduring as it was complex. So, what do we make of these Renaissance titans? The Medici encapsulate the duality of human ambition, the capacity for both creation and destruction. They were visionaries who saw the potential of art and culture as instruments of power, yet they weren't above using force to maintain their grip. Their story is one of resilience, reinvention, and the relentless pursuit of influence. In a world where power was as fleeting as a fresco in a rainstorm, the Medici managed to carve out a legacy that continues to captivate us centuries later. As we wrap up this journey through the Medici's labyrinthine legacy, let's not forget the lessons they leave behind. In a world obsessed with innovation and influence, the Medici remind us that power is as much about perception as it is about possession. Their story is a cautionary tale of the intoxicating allure of power and the relentless drive to shape history. And while their reign is long over, their impact continues to resonate, a testament to the enduring power of art, ambition, and strategic brilliance. They were in every sense the architects of their destiny, and in doing so, they helped shape ours. So next time you stroll through an art gallery or check your bank balance, remember, you're not just witnessing history, you're walking in the footsteps of the Medici. They were the masters of reinvention, proving that true legacy is not just about what you leave behind, but how you change the world while you're here. And that, my friends, is the real art of power. In the spring of 1940, as Europe teetered on the brink of catastrophe, the British political landscape was undergoing a seismic shift. Enter Winston Churchill, a man who seemed to have stepped out of a different era, with his trademark bowler hat, ever-present cigar, and a voice that could register on the Richter scale. Churchill's rise to power wasn't exactly a smooth ascent. It was more like a roller coaster ride with a few sharp turns and a surprise loop-the-loop. To say that Churchill had a larger-than-life persona is like saying the ocean is a bit damp. This was a man who once said, "I am ready to meet my maker. Whether my maker is prepared for the ordeal of meeting me is another matter." His wit was as sharp as his resolve, and he wielded both to rally a nation on the brink of despair. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In 1940, Britain was in a bit of a pickle. Neville Chamberlain, the previous Prime Minister, tried to play nice with Adolf Hitler, but appeasing a dictator turned out to be about as effective as using a paper umbrella in a monsoon. Chamberlain's resignation opened the door for Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, a position that sounds a lot more like a character from Pirates of the Caribbean than the second-in-command of the British Navy. Churchill's path to the top wasn't exactly paved with gold. He had more political comebacks than a boomerang, having switched parties twice and been in and out of favor more times than a fashion trend. But his tenacity paid off. On May 10, 1940, King George VI invited Churchill to form a government. It was a bit like being asked to captain a ship already half underwater, but Churchill was never one to shy away from a challenge, especially one that involved a good fight. Now, let's talk about Churchill's lifestyle during the Blitz. If you think your diet is questionable, consider Churchill's wartime menu: cigars, champagne, and the occasional whiskey for good measure. He famously said, "I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." That might have been true, but it's likely alcohol was still keeping score. Churchill was known for his relentless energy, a trait that would have made even the Energizer Bunny look like a couch potato. He operated on minimal sleep, often taking naps instead of full night's rest, and fueled himself with copious amounts of coffee and nicotine. Despite, or perhaps because of, his eccentric habits, Churchill's leadership was exactly what Britain needed. His speeches were masterclasses in morale boosting, with phrases like, "We shall fight on the beaches," and their finest hour becoming legendary. But for all their polish, Churchill's speeches were not always the slick, rehearsed performances we might imagine. The truth is, sometimes he improvised, and not always by choice. It's said that one time he misplaced his notes and had to wing it, which, given his verbal dexterity, was less of a disaster and more of a jazz solo, spontaneous, a bit risky, but ultimately brilliant. Churchill's leadership style was a blend of bulldog tenacity and theatrical flair. He understood that in times of crisis, the ability to inspire was as crucial as the ability to strategize. His speeches were peppered with vivid imagery and humor, the kind that could make a downtrodden populace feel like they were part of an epic saga rather than a grim reality. And in a world where the bombs were real but the morale was fragile, that was no small feat. But let's debunk a myth while we're at it. The romanticized vision of Churchill as a lone savior is a bit of a historical stretch. Yes, he was a pivotal figure, but he was also part of a broader coalition, a team of leaders and advisors who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Churchill's charisma often overshadowed the contributions of others, but he wasn't a one-man band. He was the frontman of a wartime government that was as much about collective effort as it was about individual genius. The numbers behind Churchill's energy are staggering. He worked up to 18 hours a day and maintained a schedule that would make a drill sergeant blanch. The Blitz, which lasted from September 1940 to May 1941, saw London bombed for 57 consecutive nights. During this time, Churchill's presence was a constant reassurance, his voice a clarion call above the chaos. His ability to navigate through the fog of war, literally and figuratively, was a testament to his resilience. So, what made Churchill's leadership so compelling? It was a mix of grit, showmanship, and an unshakable belief in victory. He had a knack for turning setbacks into stepping stones, delivering lines that could have been ripped from a script of an old Hollywood epic. Yet, behind the bravado was a man acutely aware of the stakes. The war wasn't just a series of battles. It was a fight for the future of civilization itself. In the early days of World War II, Churchill's leadership was characterized by a paradoxical blend of pragmatism and idealism. He understood the grim realities of war, but never let them suffocate his vision of eventual triumph. In a world teetering on the brink, he was the unyielding force of nature that Britain needed, a man not without flaws, but perhaps because of them, uniquely suited to lead in such tumultuous times. As we wrap up this first part of Churchill's wartime saga, remember this. History often paints its heroes in broad strokes, but the reality is always more nuanced. Churchill was a man of contradictions, a symbol of steadfast leadership in a world gone mad. And while the legend of Churchill often eclipses the man, it's in those blurred lines between myth and reality that we find the true measure of his legacy. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where we'll delve deeper into the decisions, dilemmas, and daring escapades that defined his tenure as Britain's wartime leader. And speaking of contradictions, let's dive into one of Churchill's less glamorous moments, the Norway campaign, which unfolded like a slapstick comedy with a touch of tragedy. It was 1940, and Churchill, now Prime Minister, had his sights set on Norway. The strategic goal was clear: deny the Nazis access to Norwegian iron ore and gain a foothold in Scandinavia. Sounds straightforward enough, right? Wrong. Picture a plan so haphazard it makes a cat chasing its tail look organized. Operation Wilfred was Churchill's brainchild, and it involved mining Norwegian waters to disrupt German shipping routes. Alas, what followed was a series of blunders that would have made even Murphy's Law blush. The British forces, plagued by indecision and poor coordination, managed to botch the whole affair. They pulled out of Norway faster than you can say strategic retreat, leaving the region to an unchallenged German occupation by June 1940. And as one does in politics, Churchill had to spin this disaster into something resembling a victory. After all, he was a master of turning lemons into a stiff gin and tonic. Now, don't misunderstand me. Churchill was not always the bumbling strategist this campaign might suggest. He had moments of sheer brilliance, but the Norway debacle was a reminder that even the greats have their off days. The campaign highlighted the chaotic state of British military planning at the time, a kind of organized chaos that had more in common with a circus than a war cabinet. And yet, somehow, Churchill kept the faith of a nation, proving that a good narrative often trumps the less glamorous reality. Next, let's talk about Churchill's Mediterranean fixation. The man was obsessed with keeping the Suez Canal open and the Mediterranean sea lanes secure. Why? Because, in his strategic map of the world, this was the jugular vein of the British Empire. Control it, and you control the flow of oil and supplies crucial to the war effort. It was all about logistics, folks. Forget the romantic notions of gallant knights and heroic battles. This was a war sustained by the unglamorous reality of supply chains and fuel depots. Churchill's Mediterranean strategy wasn't without its critics. Some argued that it diverted resources from the main event, the Western Front. But Churchill believed in his gut, or maybe it was the cigars talking, that the Mediterranean was the key to victory. His gamble would pay off in North Africa, where the British forces finally got a win against Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein in late 1942. Churchill famously remarked, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was a turning point that justified his Mediterranean obsession, at least in his eyes. Now, let's pivot to the international stage. Churchill was quite the juggler when it came to managing alliances. The man had Roosevelt on one hand and Stalin on the other. Talk about a diplomatic balancing act. With Roosevelt, Churchill worked tirelessly to secure American support. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 was his crowning achievement, a lifeline that sent billions of dollars worth of supplies across the Atlantic. He once said, "No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt." If that doesn't paint a vivid picture of their relationship, nothing will. Then there was Stalin. Uncle Joe, a man who could freeze the room with a glance. Churchill had to hold his nose and shake hands with the Soviet leader, a necessary evil in the fight against the Nazis. Their alliance was one of convenience, not camaraderie. Churchill famously quipped, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." It was an alliance fraught with tension, but one that was crucial for the war effort. And let's not overlook Churchill's eccentricities, which somehow reinforced his genius in the public eye. He had a penchant for dictating speeches while soaking in the bathtub or convening meetings in his pajamas. Only Churchill could pull off such theatrical flair and still be taken seriously. It was said that he once dictated a memo while stark naked, insisting that clothes are mere superfluities. It's hard to imagine another leader who could make such antics look like the hallmarks of brilliance rather than madness. But here's the thing. Churchill's quirks were more than just amusing anecdotes. They were part of his larger-than-life persona, a carefully crafted image that kept him in the limelight and, more importantly, in control. In a world gone mad, perhaps it took a bit of madness to see things clearly. Or maybe Churchill was just the ultimate showman, a man who understood that in times of crisis, perception was as important as policy. So, what do we make of Churchill's strategic decisions? They were a mixed bag, to be sure, a blend of brilliance and blunder. He had an uncanny ability to inspire confidence, even when his plans were as shaky as a Jenga tower. His leadership was a study in contrasts, sometimes misguided, often controversial, but always resolute. And while history might be written by the victors, it's worth remembering that those victories were often hard-won and fraught with peril. As we pause here, think of Churchill as the ultimate chess player, moving pieces across a board that spanned continents. But unlike chess, the stakes were real, the outcomes uncertain. The war was his defining moment, a crucible that tested every ounce of his resolve and cunning. And while the man was far from infallible, it's undeniable that his stubborn optimism and indomitable spirit helped steer Britain through its darkest hour. We're not done yet, though. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into Churchill's wartime decisions, explore the broader implications of his leadership, and continue this journey through the high stakes and high drama of World War II. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that the story is never as simple as it seems. The truth is nuanced, the heroes flawed, and the narrative ever-evolving. In the swirling chaos of World War II, Churchill's leadership faced challenges that could make lesser leaders cry uncle. The mid-war years were a real test of his mettle, a period when the fog of war was thick and full of military mishaps and political landmines. Picture Churchill juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle, all while dodging rotten tomatoes from the press gallery. It was a time when every decision was scrutinized, every setback magnified, and every triumph questioned. First, let's address the economic elephant in the room, the staggering cost of keeping Britain in the fight. The war wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was also a war of wits and wallets, and Britain's wallet was under more strain than a pair of skinny jeans after Thanksgiving dinner. By 1941, the cost of maintaining the war effort had ballooned to an eye-popping £50 million per day. That's right, million with an M, a number so astronomical it could have its own orbit. Britain was essentially burning through money faster than a lottery winner on a Vegas spree. How's that for fiscal fireworks? The economic strain was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it galvanized industry and innovation. Necessity is, after all, the mother of invention. On the other hand, it left the country teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Churchill had to perform a financial balancing act that would make a Cirque du Soleil performer envious. He relied heavily on the Lend-Lease Act, which was the wartime equivalent of a no-interest credit card from Uncle Sam. It was a lifesaver, sending vital supplies across the Atlantic and keeping Britain's economic heart beating. But money wasn't the only thing in short supply. Public patience was wearing thin too. Churchill's leadership was increasingly under the microscope. Critics were quick to pounce on any perceived misstep. And let's be honest, Churchill provided them with plenty of fodder. Military setbacks were as common as tea breaks in England. The deep raid in 1942 is a case in point. What was intended as a reconnaissance in force turned into a debacle of epic proportions, with nearly 60% of the Allied forces involved being killed, wounded, or captured. It was a harsh reminder that not all of Churchill's gambles paid off. Yet, despite these setbacks, Churchill had a knack for turning public criticism into a kind of grim camaraderie. He had a love-hate relationship with the media that would have given today's politicians a run for their money. The press could be his harshest critics, but they also provided a platform for his indomitable spirit. He once quipped, "You have enemies. Good. That means you've stood up for something, sometime in your life." It was his way of flipping the narrative, portraying criticism as a badge of honor rather than a mark of failure. Churchill's speeches during these years were as much about damage control as they were about inspiration. He wielded words like a surgeon wields a scalpel, cutting through the despair with phrases that could rally even the most jaded of audiences. His knack for oratory was both his shield and sword, deflecting criticism while inspiring hope. It was a delicate dance, a verbal tango with the nation's morale hanging in the balance. And while not all his speeches were home runs, they were certainly a masterclass in political theatrics. But let's debunk a myth here. The idea that Churchill was unflappable is a bit of historical airbrushing. The reality is, he was as human as the rest of us, prone to bouts of doubt and frustration. There were moments when the weight of leadership bore down heavily on him, when the cracks in his armor showed. Yet, it was precisely this vulnerability that made him relatable, a reminder that even a giant of history could feel the ground shake beneath his feet. It was a sobering reality check for a nation that needed its heroes to be human. The mid-war years also saw Churchill navigating the minefield of political pressure. His coalition government was a mixed bag of personalities and priorities, a veritable United Nations of political agendas. Keeping this motley crew aligned was a Herculean task. Churchill had to be part diplomat, part disciplinarian, and all leader, a role that often required more tact than a dinner party within laws. Yet, despite the political infighting, Churchill managed to keep the ship of state on course, steering it through waters choppier than a North Sea crossing. And while we're on the subject of political pressure, let's talk about the home front. Britain was under siege, not just from Nazi bombers, but from the harsh realities of war. Rationing was a way of life, with everything from butter to bacon in short supply. The British public was living on a diet that would make a modern dietitian wince, yet they soldiered on with a stiff upper lip and a sense of humor sharper than a double-edged sword. It was the Blitz spirit, a remarkable resilience that Churchill both admired and inspired. The war years also brought about a significant shift in social dynamics. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles previously reserved for men. It was a revolution in heels and overalls, a change that would have lasting implications for British society. Churchill, ever the pragmatist, recognized the value of this new workforce, even if his views on gender roles were as dated as his choice of cigars. It was a time of change, a reshuffling of societal norms that would echo long after the war ended. As we delve further into Churchill's wartime odyssey, remember that history is as much about the journey as it is about the destination. Churchill's story is one of resilience and resolve, a saga of triumphs and trials that continues to captivate and confound. The war may have tested his leadership, but it also defined his legacy, a legacy that is both celebrated and scrutinized to this day. So, as we pause on the brink of yet another chapter in this epic tale, consider the complexities and contradictions that made Churchill the leader he was. He was a man of his time, yet ahead of his time, a figure whose shadow looms large over the annals of history. And while the story is far from over, it's clear that Churchill's legacy is as indomitable as the man himself, a testament to the power of conviction in the face of adversity. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the threads of Churchill's wartime leadership, exploring the decisions and dilemmas that shaped not just a nation, but the world. Because in the end, history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry of human experience, a story that is as much about the future as it is about the past. As we dive deeper into the historical roller coaster that was Winston Churchill's leadership during World War II, let's pick up where we left off. The story of Churchill in WW2 is like a suspenseful thriller filled with unexpected twists and heart-stopping moments, minus the popcorn, plus a lot of tea. We're entering the phase where Churchill's strategic decisions became the stuff of legend, and the stakes were higher than a kite at a music festival. By 1943, the Allied forces had started to see the faint glimmer of light at the end of a very dark tunnel. The tide was turning, and Churchill was at the helm, steering the ship with his signature blend of bravado and bulldog determination. It was during these crucial years that he and his allies began to lay the groundwork for what would become one of the most significant turning points of the war, the D-Day landings. But before we get to the beaches of Normandy, let's set the scene. The war effort was a colossal undertaking, with plans as intricate as a Swiss watch. The Allies faced the Herculean task of coordinating a massive invasion across the English Channel, a body of water that had more in common with a turbulent obstacle course than a calm passageway. And let's not forget, the Nazis had fortified the French coastline with more defenses than a paranoid millionaire's mansion. The planning for D-Day, or Operation Overlord, if you prefer its official title, was a logistical nightmare wrapped in a strategic enigma. We're talking about mobilizing over 156 000 troops, 11 000 aircraft, and 7 000 ships, all synchronized like a military ballet on a scale that would make even the most ambitious flash mob look like a tea party. The cost of this operation was astronomical, stretching the wallets of the Allied nations thinner than a British pancake. Churchill, ever the astute strategist, knew the stakes were monumental. He had to keep morale high and doubts low, a task that would test even the most seasoned of motivational speakers. Churchill had a way with words that could make even the bleakest of situations sound like a grand adventure. His speeches leading up to D-Day were masterclasses in rhetorical prowess, pep talks with a touch of Shakespearean flair and a dash of gallows humor. "We are waiting for the long-expected invasion. So are the fishes," he quipped, reminding everyone that anticipation was a shared burden. Despite the bravado, Churchill was acutely aware of the risks involved. The success of D-Day was far from guaranteed, and failure could have set the Allied cause back significantly. The Germans were not about to roll over and let the Allies waltz into France. They had the formidable Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the so-called Desert Fox, fortifying the Atlantic Wall, a series of defenses that stretched from the Netherlands to the Spanish border. The economic backdrop was equally daunting. Britain's finances were still recovering from the previous war years, and the prospect of a prolonged campaign in Western Europe was enough to make any Chancellor of the Exchequer break out in a cold sweat. The British economy was hanging by a thread, propped up by American aid and the sheer willpower of a nation determined to see the job through. Yet, Churchill managed to keep the public and his military chiefs focused on the prize. His optimism was infectious, a kind of charismatic contagion that spread through the ranks. He had a knack for turning the war into a narrative of heroism, a saga where every setback was merely a prelude to eventual triumph. "If you're going through hell, keep going," he famously said, encapsulating his relentless drive to push forward, no matter the odds. And then, on June 6, 1944, D-Day arrived with the dawn. The operation was a high-stakes gamble, the largest amphibious assault in history, and it unfolded with all the precision of a military symphony. The weather had threatened to delay the invasion, but a brief window of opportunity presented itself, and the Allies seized it with both hands. The landings on the beaches of Normandy, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were as much a feat of human endurance as they were of military strategy. The initial landings were brutal, with the beaches resembling a scene from Dante's Inferno. Omaha Beach, in particular, was a bloodbath, with American troops facing fierce resistance from entrenched German forces. The cost was steep. By the end of the day, the Allies suffered more than 10,000 casualties, a grim reminder of the brutal reality of war. Yet, despite the chaos and carnage, the operation was a success. The Allies had secured a foothold in Europe, and the liberation of France was underway. Churchill's role in this monumental moment was not just as a strategist, but as a symbol of unyielding resolve. He was the cheerleader-in-chief, the voice that rallied the troops and the public alike. His speeches following D-Day were a blend of humility and hubris, acknowledging the sacrifices made while reinforcing the belief that victory was within reach. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning, he declared, reminding everyone that there was still a long road ahead. While the romantic image of Churchill as the sole architect of victory is tempting, it's important to remember that he was part of a larger team. The success of D-Day was a testament to the combined efforts of the Allied command, a coalition of leaders who each played a vital role. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was the man tasked with executing the plan, and his leadership was crucial to the operation's success. Churchill knew how to share the spotlight when it counted, a leader who understood that collaboration was key to overcoming the challenges they faced. In the months following D-Day, the Allies made significant advances across Europe, liberating Paris by August and moving steadily towards Germany. It was a turning point in the war, a shift in momentum that put the Axis powers on the back foot. Churchill's vision of victory was starting to take shape, a testament to his ability to see the bigger picture even when the details were daunting. Yet, the war was far from over, and Churchill knew it. He had to maintain the momentum, keep the spirits high, and ensure that the sacrifices made were not in vain. The winter of 1944-45 was a challenging time, with the Battle of the Bulge serving as a stark reminder that the Nazis were not ready to concede defeat. Churchill's response was one of steely determination, urging his commanders to press on and not let up the pressure. Through it all, Churchill managed to keep his trademark humor intact. He once remarked, "I am easily satisfied with the very best," a quip that underscored his relentless pursuit of excellence. His ability to find light in the darkest of times was a source of inspiration, a beacon for a nation weary from years of war. As we journey through this chapter of Churchill's wartime leadership, it's clear that his legacy is a complex tapestry of triumphs and trials. He was a man who thrived in adversity, a leader whose optimism was as much a weapon as the tanks and planes he commanded. The D-Day landings were a pivotal moment, but they were just one part of a larger story, a story that continues to captivate and confound, reminding us that history is never as simple as it seems. So, stay with us as we continue to explore Churchill's wartime saga, delving into the final stages of the conflict and the challenges that lay ahead. Because in the end, Churchill's story is not just about the battles won, but the indomitable spirit that drove him to face the impossible. And while the war may have tested his leadership to the limits, it also defined his legacy, a legacy that echoes through the corridors of time, a testament to the power of conviction in the face of adversity. And so, the final act of the World War II saga unfolded with Churchill at the helm, steering Britain through victory's twilight. As the Allies pushed into Germany, Churchill's vision of a free Europe was coming into focus, but the end of the war was more of a slow fade than a curtain drop. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, marked the official surrender of Nazi Germany. The streets of London erupted in celebration, with Churchill delivering a speech that rang with triumph. Yet beneath the jubilation lay the cold, hard truth. The war had left Britain battered, its economy as worn as an old pair of boots. With the German threat neutralized, Churchill turned his attention to the east, where the war against Japan still raged. But let's face it, his focus had shifted. The end was near, and he knew it. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world was finally at peace, or as peaceful as a post-war world could be. Yet, the victory came with a price tag that could make even the most seasoned accountant break a sweat. Britain was pound 21 billion in debt, an amount so staggering it might as well have been monopoly money. Now, you think that leading Britain through its darkest hour would secure Churchill's place at the top, right? Wrong. In the 1945 general election, the British public handed him a pink slip, voting the Labour Party into power with a landslide victory. It was like telling the quarterback who just won the Super Bowl that he was being traded. Clement Attlee took the reins, promising social reforms and a welfare state, an enticing prospect for a war-weary populace. Churchill, the wartime hero, was suddenly yesterday's news, left to ponder how the winds of change could be so swift and cold. How did this political plot twist happen, you ask? Well, the public mood had shifted. After years of hardship, British people wanted change, not more of the same. The Labour Party, with its focus on housing, healthcare and jobs, offered a vision of a brighter, more equitable future. Meanwhile, Churchill's campaign speeches, filled with rhetoric about the dangers of socialism, did little to resonate with an electorate yearning for a fresh start. The man who had once rallied a nation now found himself on the outside looking in. But Churchill wasn't one to fade quietly into the night. Oh no, he was like a boomerang. Just when you thought he was gone, he'd come back with a vengeance. He remained the leader of the Conservative Party, his eyes fixed on the political stage. His role shifted from Prime Minister to elder statesman, a political heavyweight whose opinions still carried significant clout. Yet, the post-war world was a different beast, one that required a different kind of leadership, a fact that Churchill grappled with as he navigated the choppy waters of peacetime politics. Churchill's attempts to stay relevant were a mix of hits and misses. He was an advocate for European unity, famously calling for a United States of Europe in a 1946 speech in Zurich. It was a visionary idea, one that hinted at the future European Union, yet it was perhaps too forward-thinking for its time. Churchill's focus on international diplomacy and anti-communism kept him in the spotlight, but the domestic issues he had mastered during the war were now overshadowed by the pressing demands of reconstruction and recovery. In 1951, Churchill staged a political comeback, once again becoming Prime Minister at the ripe old age of 77. His second stint was marked by a more subdued leadership style, a reflection of both his advancing years and the changing political landscape. The world was now in the throes of the Cold War, a new kind of conflict that required a different playbook. Churchill, with his experience and gravitas, was a steadying hand, but his health was failing, and the demands of the office were taking their toll. By 1955, Churchill had run out of steam. He retired from public life, leaving behind a legacy as complex and multifaceted as the man himself. His career was a tapestry woven from threads of triumph and tragedy, a blend of contradictions that defy simple categorization. He was a man of immense talent and deep flaws, a leader whose mythos was as much his own creation as it was a product of history. So, what do we make of Churchill's legacy? Was he the lion-hearted savior of Britain, or a relic of a bygone era? The truth is, he was both, and neither. His wartime leadership was a masterclass in resilience, a testament to the power of words and will in the face of adversity. Yet, his post-war years reveal a man struggling to adapt to a world that had moved on from the one he had known. Churchill's image, like the man himself, is layered and complex. The romanticized version of him as the indomitable bulldog is only part of the story. The reality is more nuanced, a blend of brilliance and bluster that speaks to the human condition. He was a statesman who understood the power of perception, a master at crafting a narrative that would endure long after he was gone. As we close the book on Churchill's story, it's worth noting that his legacy is not just about the past, it's about the lessons it offers for the future. In an age of uncertainty, his unwavering belief in the power of conviction serves as a reminder that leadership is as much about vision as it is about action. And while history may continue to debate his place among the greats, one thing is certain. Churchill's story is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. So, there you have it. A journey through the life and times of Winston Churchill. A tale as epic as any Hollywood blockbuster, but with a script written by the hand of history itself. As we drift into the realm of reflection, remember that the stories of the past are more than just chronicles of events. They are lessons in humanity, a mirror reflecting our own struggles and triumphs. And in the end, isn't that what makes history truly timeless? In medieval England, hunting was more than just an outdoor adventure. It was a battleground of class and survival, a game of thrones played out with bows and arrows, not just words and swords. Picture this, a landscape where the rich and powerful roamed lush forests, not just for sport, but to reinforce their social status, while the peasants watched from the sidelines, dreaming of venison that would never grace their tables. This wasn't just about who could bag the biggest buck. It was about who had the right to even step foot in the forest. Let's talk about the forest laws, those delightful little regulations introduced by William the Conqueror. You know, the guy who decided that England needed a Norman facelift after 1066. These laws weren't just about protecting deer, they were about protecting power. William turned vast swaths of English countryside into royal playgrounds, and if you weren't on the guest list, well, tough luck. A whopping 1/3 of England became royal forest land. That's right, about 25,000 square miles were converted into exclusive hunting grounds, a middle finger to the local populace who suddenly found their backyards off limits. The funny thing is, William didn't do this because he had a soft spot for Bambi, but because hunting was the medieval equivalent of a royal spa day. It was a status symbol, a way for the elite to flex their wealth and power. The nobility would dress in the medieval version of designer camo, complete with hunting horns and dogs, and gallop off into the woods to snag themselves some dinner and a little bragging rights at the next banquet. For the peasants, on the other hand, the forest was a supermarket of sorts, filled with everything they needed to survive. Firewood, berries, nuts, and yes, game. But thanks to the forest laws, the penalty for poaching was not just a slap on the wrist. Get caught snaring a rabbit, and you could lose a hand or an eye. Yet despite the draconian repercussions, poaching was rampant. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and for many, the risk of a gruesome punishment was worth the reward of a full belly. The social hierarchy of hunting was as strict as a medieval nun. The king and his nobles rode at the top of the pyramid, with exclusive rights to the best hunting grounds. Below them, the gentry had limited rights, and at the bottom, the peasants were left to scavenge whatever they could find legally, that is. The idea was simple: restrict access to resources and reinforce the social order. It was a not-so-subtle reminder of who held the power and who was meant to know their place. Hunting wasn't just a pastime. It was woven into the very fabric of medieval life. It was an economic necessity for many, providing meat, fur, and hides, which were valuable commodities. But it was also a political tool, with land ownership and hunting rights becoming a way to exert control over the masses. The nobility's exclusive rights to hunt were a stark reminder of the feudal system, where land equaled power, and the peasants were at the mercy of their lords. And while the romantic image of a nobleman on horseback, riding through the misty woods with a hawk on his arm, is certainly appealing, the reality was far grimmer. Hunting was hard, dangerous work, and for the peasants who dared to defy the forest laws, it was a matter of life and death. The dichotomy between the idyllic and the harsh realities of medieval hunting is striking, a testament to the power dynamics of the time. So, next time you hear someone waxing poetic about the good old days of medieval hunts, just remember, it was a world where the rich literally got the lion's share, and the poor were left with the scraps if they were lucky enough to get even that. So, while the peasants were left to dream of the venison roast that never was, the nobility was all about the gear, the glam, and the get-up. Let's dive into the medieval hunter's toolkit, where status was measured not just by the number of antlers on the wall, but by the quality of one's crossbow and the cut of one's cloak. Starting with the crossbow, essentially the Tesla of medieval weaponry. This bad boy wasn't just a tool, It was a statement. With a price tag that could rival the GDP of a small village, only the wealthiest could afford to casually strut about the forest with one in hand. Some crossbows cost upwards of 300 pence, which back then could buy you a decent plot of land or a year's worth of bread. And that was just for the basic model. If you wanted the deluxe version, complete with ornate engravings and ivory inlay, well, you were looking at a king's ransom. But let's not forget the longbow, the humble workhorse of the hunting world. While it might not have had the swagger of a crossbow, the longbow was the medieval equivalent of a trusty pickup truck. Reliable, sturdy, and capable of getting the job done. It was also far more accessible, both in terms of cost and use. Made from yew wood, a good longbow could shoot an arrow over 200 yards with terrifying accuracy. This was the weapon of choice for those who couldn't drop a fortune on a crossbow, but still wanted a fighting chance against the local deer population. Now, onto the attire, because what's the point of hunting if you can't look fabulous while doing it? Forget about practical camouflage. Medieval hunters dressed to impress. The nobility wore vibrant colors, think reds, blues, and greens, that screamed, "Look at me," rather than blend in. This wasn't about sneaking up on your prey. It was about announcing your arrival with all the subtlety of a royal parade. Fabrics were often luxurious wool or linen, lined with fur and embellished with embroidery. A noble's hunting outfit could easily cost more than a peasant's annual wages. And let's not overlook the accessories. Hunting horns, made from polished metal or ivory, were not just for signaling fellow hunters, they were status symbols. The same went for the hunting dogs, which were meticulously bred and trained, each one a reflection of its master's wealth and prestige. These packs of hounds were as much a part of the hunting ensemble as the bow or the cloak, and owning a fine set of dogs was akin to owning a fleet of luxury cars today. The medieval nobility also had their preferred weapon makers, those artisans who rose to prominence through quality and reputation. In a world without Yelp reviews, word of mouth was king, and a good weapon maker could become the medieval equivalent of a celebrity chef. Their names might not echo through history like the kings and queens they armed, but their craftsmanship spoke for itself. So, next time you imagine a medieval hunt, picture this: a posse of nobles, decked out like a Renaissance fashion show, riding through the woods with weapons that cost more than a peasant's yearly income, all to catch a deer that was probably more terrified of their outfits than their arrows. The romance of the hunt was very much alive, but it was a romance reserved for those who could afford to participate. This wasn't just about catching dinner. It was about catching the eyes of your peers and reminding everyone of your place in the social hierarchy. The gear and garb of the medieval hunter were as much about showmanship as they were about practicality, a testament to the opulence and extravagance that defined the upper echelons of medieval society. So, while the common folk might have been dreaming of a rabbit stew, the nobility was living out a fairy tale, complete with golden threads and gilded arrows. Stay tuned, because there's more to this story, and we're just getting started. Now, let's take a peek behind the velvet curtain of the medieval hunting extravaganza. Setting up a royal hunting party was like organizing a blockbuster movie premiere, minus the red carpet, but with plenty of pomp. It was the medieval version of an all-hands-on-deck situation, involving scores of attendants, a caravan of equipment, and of course, the A-list cast of nobles. The king, or whoever was leading the hunt, didn't just roll out of bed and grab his bow. No, this was a logistical operation that made military campaigns look like a casual picnic. First up, the guest list. Only the creme de la creme of society was invited, which meant you had to be someone who mattered, or at least mattered to the king. Once invitations were sent, the real fun began, assembling the gear. Think of it as a medieval camping trip on steroids. Tents were pitched, food supplies gathered, and the finest goblets and platters packed for the post-hunt feast. Because, let's face it, when you're out in the wilds, you still need to dine like royalty. In fact, some of these hunting expeditions were so elaborate they could last for days or even weeks, turning the forest into a temporary court. And then there were the unsung heroes of the hunt, the hunting dogs. These canine companions weren't just there to look cute, they were essential to the operation. Breeds were carefully selected and trained for specific roles. There were the scent hounds, like the bloodhounds, who could track a deer over miles, following a trail that was invisible to human eyes. Then you had the sight hounds, such as greyhounds, who would chase down prey with speed and agility. Each pack of dogs was a well-oiled machine, and owning a competent pack was a mark of prestige. Training these dogs was no small feat. It required time, patience, and a hefty investment. A well-trained hunting dog was worth its weight in gold, or at least a lot of silver coins. This wasn't just about loyalty or companionship. These dogs were working animals, integral to the success of the hunt. Failure to perform could mean a wasted day and a lot of grumpy nobles, so you can bet every bark and bay was fine-tuned to perfection. In fact, the dogs were so vital that they were often given their own attendants, tasked with their care and training. Imagine being a medieval dog whisperer. Talk about a niche job market. Once the hunting party was underway, it was a spectacle to behold. A cavalcade of nobles on horseback, accompanied by their loyal hounds, cut through the countryside with all the subtlety of a royal procession. The goal was simple: find and corner the prey. But let's not pretend it was easy. Deer, boar, and other game weren't just waiting around to be caught. They were elusive, swift, and knew the forests better than any human. This is where the dogs truly shone. They would pick up the scent and lead the hunters on a chase that could span several miles. When the moment of truth finally arrived, and the prey was within reach, that's when the archery skills came into play. A swift, accurate shot was needed to bring down the animal, preferably with as little suffering as possible. And let's be real, the nobles weren't there to miss. Hitting the target was a matter of pride, and a successful kill was a chance to show off in front of one's peers. But the hunt didn't end with the kill. Oh no, that was just the beginning of the medieval pageantry. Once the animal was down, the real ceremony began. The carcass was treated with a respect that bordered on reverence. There was the ritual of the unmaking, where the animal was carefully butchered, and every part was accounted for. The heart and liver, considered delicacies, were often given to the most esteemed guest or the leader of the hunt. The hunting party would then gather for what was essentially a forest-based after-party, complete with a feast. The meat was roasted over open fires, and the participants dined under the stars, toasting each other with goblets of wine. It was a chance to revel in the success of the day and swap stories of daring chases and near misses. There was music, laughter, and perhaps a few exaggerated tales of bravery. It was the medieval equivalent of a victory lap, a time to celebrate not just the kill, but the camaraderie and skill that made it possible. Yet beneath the glamour and glory lay the stark reality of the times. This was a world where a few enjoyed opulence while many lived in austerity. The pageantry of the hunt was a reflection of the feudal system itself, a way to reinforce the social order and remind everyone of their place. And though the forest echoed with the sounds of celebration, outside its borders, the peasants toiled on, dreaming of the feasts they would never attend. So, while we might romanticize the image of the noble hunter, riding bravely through the woods with his loyal hounds, it's worth remembering the other side of the story. For every royal hunting party, there were countless others living on the fringes of this grand spectacle, their lives intertwined with the whims of those who ruled the land. The medieval hunt was as much about power and prestige as it was about sport, a tradition that showcased the best and worst of human nature. As we continue this journey through the forests of medieval England, keep in mind the layers of history hidden within the trees. There's more to uncover about this fascinating, complex world, where the thrill of the chase was matched only by the weight of its implications. Stay tuned, because the story of medieval hunting is far from over. And here's the kicker. The opulent hunting parties were about as economically sensible as a gold-plated horse. They were like the medieval version of throwing a destination wedding, lavish, extravagant, and a surefire way to drain the royal coffers. Hosting a hunting expedition wasn't just a casual day out. It was an exercise in financial gymnastics that could make even the wealthiest nobles sweat under their fur-lined collars. Let's break it down. First, there's the cost of assembling the entourage. We're talking about dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. Nobles, attendants, cooks, musicians, and of course, the retinue of dogs, each with their own handler. Feeding this crowd. A logistical nightmare worthy of its own department at the Exchequer. A single day's hunt could cost upwards of £200, a staggering sum when you consider that a skilled craftsman earned about £3 a year. Suddenly, your weekend getaway looks a bit more like a fiscal cliff dive. Then there's the gear. Remember those crossbows and longbows? They didn't just grow on trees. A top-of-the-line crossbow could set a lord back about 300 pence, and that's before adding in the cost of maintaining the armory, paying the bowires, and replacing all those fancy arrows. And let's not forget the wardrobe. Those vibrant, luxurious costumes weren't just for show. They were the medieval equivalent of haute couture, with a price tag to match. A single embroidered cloak could cost more than a peasant's yearly income, and that was just one piece of the ensemble. But who footed the bill for this medieval extravaganza? That would be the landowning nobility, who had no qualms about squeezing every last drop of revenue from their tenants to fund their hunting escapades. Rents, tithes, and taxes were diverted to ensure that the lords could play at being knights of the forest. Meanwhile, the peasants, who were the economic backbone of this system, were left scraping by, dreaming of the venison they were helping to pay for but would never taste. Of course, the economic implications of hunting went beyond just the costs. Hunting was a tool of political maneuvering, a way to curry favor and forge alliances. Inviting a rival noble to join a hunting party was akin to a high-stakes diplomatic summit, a chance to negotiate marriages, land deals, and military alliances while pretending to focus on the chase. In a world where power was as much about perception as reality, a successful hunt could boost a noble standing at court, while a failed one could tarnish it. And let's not forget the role of hunting as a display of wealth and power. In medieval England, where appearances could be as valuable as gold, the ability to host a grand hunt was a statement of dominance. It was a not-so-subtle reminder to both allies and adversaries of who held the reins of power. The spectacle of a hunting party, with its cavalcade of nobles, dogs, and attendants, was a mobile advertisement of feudal might, a rolling testament to the owner's resources and influence. This brings us to the myth of the chivalrous hunt, a romanticized notion of noble knights galloping through the woods, their hearts full of honor and their arrows true. The reality was a bit more pragmatic. The hunts were less about valor and more about ensuring that the right heads were nodded, the right hands were shaken, and the correct messages were sent. Hunting was as much a political theater as it was a sport, with each act carefully choreographed to reinforce the social hierarchy. Behind the pageantry and the politics, there was also a grim reality, the environmental impact of these hunts. A single royal hunting party could devastate a forest, stripping it of game and trampling its undergrowth. This wasn't just a pastime. It was an ecological event, with consequences that rippled through the local ecosystem. The romantic image of the noble hunter in harmony with nature, more like a medieval bulldozer, reshaping the landscape to suit the whims of the elite. So, while the legends of chivalrous hunts may capture our imagination, the truth is much more complex. Hunting was a multifaceted affair, a blend of sport, politics, and economic might, where the balance of power was as precarious as a deer caught in the crosshairs. The next time you hear tales of noble hunts, remember that beneath the romantic veneer lies a world of fiscal juggling, political gamesmanship, and social stratification. As we continue to unravel the intricate tapestry of medieval hunting, keep in mind the layers of history that are still waiting to be discovered. The story is far from over, and the forest holds many more secrets. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this fascinating chapter of history, where the thrill of the chase was only the beginning. As we stroll down the leafy lanes of medieval England one last time, it's essential to understand that hunting wasn't just a blip on the historical radar. It left a mark that would echo for centuries. The forests were more than just the backdrop for a noble's weekend jaunt. They were ecosystems, economies, and symbols of power, all wrapped into one. So, let's dive into the long-term impact of this age-old pastime on England's landscape and society. First off, let's talk about the ecological footprint of these medieval hunting escapades. Picture a royal hunting party as a steamroller of extravagance, chugging through the woods and leaving a path of ecological upheaval in its wake. The rampant hunting didn't just tick off a few deer, it reshaped entire ecosystems. Forests that had once been teeming with wildlife found their populations decimated by these elaborate expeditions. In some areas, species like the European bison and wolves were hunted to extinction by the 13th century. The nobleman's ambition to showcase his prowess and fill his larder had a deep-seated impact on biodiversity, setting off a chain of environmental changes that rippled through the centuries. The landscape itself wasn't immune to these aristocratic whims. The creation of royal forests wasn't just a matter of slapping a sign on a tree and calling it a day. These areas were subject to intense management, often at the expense of the local flora and fauna. The forest laws, those draconian decrees we love to loathe, enforced strict regulations that altered the natural landscape to suit the economic and recreational needs of the elite. Forest clearings were made, water sources redirected, and enclosures built, all to optimize the hunting experience for the privileged few. As a result, vast swaths of land were transformed from wild, untamed woods into manicured hunting grounds, a legacy that can still be seen in the patchwork of England's countryside today. Now, let's shift gears and talk economics. Hunting wasn't just a pastime, it was a power move, a medieval flex that showcased one's wealth and influence. The creation of royal hunting grounds often involved the seizure of land from local communities, displacing the very people who relied on these resources for survival. It was a classic case of rich man's pleasure, poor man's plight, with the nobility's lavish hunts funded by the toil and tithes of the peasantry. While the lords were out gallivanting through the woods, the common folk were left to foot the bill, their livelihoods tied to the whims of their betters. This economic disparity wasn't just a temporary inconvenience. It was a cornerstone of the feudal system, an enduring reminder of the unequal distribution of wealth and power. But hunting wasn't all doom and gloom, at least not in the cultural sense. It left behind a rich tapestry of myths, legends, and traditions that have wormed their way into the modern imagination. The romantic image of the noble hunter, clad in finery and astride a gallant steed, has been immortalized in art, literature, and folklore. Robin Hood, that most famous outlaw, has become the poster child for the defiance of the forest laws, a symbol of the common man's struggle against oppression. The tales of knights and nobles on the hunt have inspired countless stories, feeding our fascination with chivalry and adventure. Despite these enduring myths, the reality was far less glamorous. The truth is, medieval hunting was as much about politics and power as it was about sport. It was a tool of control, means of reinforcing the social order and keeping the masses in check. The nobility's exclusive rights to hunt were a not-so-subtle reminder of who held the reins of power, and the penalties for poaching were a stark warning to those who dared to challenge the status quo. In this sense, the hunt was a microcosm of medieval society, a reflection of the larger power dynamics at play. So, what can we take away from this deep dive into the world of medieval hunting? For starters, it's a reminder of the complex interplay between nature and society, a dance of human ambition and ecological consequence. The legacy of medieval hunting is a reminder of how our actions can shape the world around us, for better or worse. It's a testament to the enduring allure of myth and the harsh realities that often lurk beneath the surface. In the end, the story of medieval hunting is one of contrasts, romance and reality, power and poverty, myth and truth. It's a chapter of history that continues to captivate, intrigue, and teach us about the nature of humanity itself. As we close this book on the hunts of yore, let's remember that the thrill of the chase is as much about the journey as the destination, a journey that has left its mark on the landscape, the culture, and the collective imagination. And who knows, the next time you find yourself wandering through an English wood, you might just catch a whisper of the past, echoing through the trees. The late 1970 wasn't just about disco balls, bell-bottoms, and questionable hairstyles. Amidst the haze of polyester and platform shoes, something far more sinister was lurking in the shadows, and it wasn't just the fear of showing up to a party in the same outfit as someone else. It was a mysterious illness that, quite frankly, had doctors scratching their heads harder than a group of confused cats. This was the dawn of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, a time when confusion reigned supreme and fear spread faster than a rumor at a high school reunion. In 1981, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, reported the first cases of what we now know as AIDS in 5 previously healthy young men in Los Angeles. These men were suffering from a rare kind of pneumonia called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, PCP, which really was a name only a mother could love. The kicker, all 5 men were gay, which, given the social climate of the time, made the illness not just a medical mystery, but a cultural flashpoint too. If confusion was an Olympic sport, the medical community would have taken gold. Initially, they were as clueless as a penguin at a tropical beach party. Doctors were sifting through symptoms without a clear understanding of the enemy they were facing. The disease seemed to target the immune system, turning it into a scene from a horror movie where the good guys, our immune cells, were being picked off one by one. By the end of 1981, there were 270 reported cases of severe immune deficiency among gay men, and 121 of those men had died. That's a mortality rate that would make even the Grim Reaper raise an eyebrow. The public, meanwhile, was reacting with the kind of hysteria usually reserved for surprise pop quizzes. People were afraid, and misinformation spread like wildfire. There were bizarre theories about the disease being a divine punishment, or, more creatively, the result of government experiments gone awry. Some even thought it was transmitted through casual contact, which led to all sorts of awkward social interactions. It was a time when shaking hands could induce more panic than getting caught in a revolving door. As the mysterious disease claimed more lives, the media dubbed it with charmingly insensitive names like gay cancer and GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, which only added fuel to the fire of public paranoia. The stigma was as rampant as the disease itself, creating a social divide that was as obvious as a bad toupee. Fear of the unknown can be a powerful thing, and in this case, it was dividing communities and isolating those who were already vulnerable. Despite the chaos, a few brave souls in the scientific community decided to roll up their sleeves and tackle this puzzle head-on. They knew they were facing a formidable opponent, one that didn't play by the rules. Researchers began to suspect a virus was at play, possibly spread through blood and sexual contact. But without the luxury of today's technology, their detective work was akin to trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle in the dark, with half the pieces missing. Meanwhile, the government's response was slower than a snail on a lazy Sunday stroll. It wasn't until 1982 that the term AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, was coined, and even then, funding for research was limited. You could say that the financial support was about as generous as a miser during a recession. It took years, and a lot of public pressure, before significant resources were dedicated to understanding and combating the epidemic. Through the fog of confusion, the death toll was rising with grim determination. By the end of 1982, AIDS had been reported in several European countries and parts of Africa, in addition to the United States, confirming everyone's worst fears. This wasn't just a local problem. As the disease spread across continents, it became clear that this epidemic was as indiscriminate as it was deadly. Public health messages began to circulate, but were often as clear as mud. With little understanding of the disease, early attempts at education were like trying to teach algebra to a room full of toddlers, well-intentioned but not particularly effective. There was talk of safe sex practices and avoiding blood contact, but without a solid understanding of the virus. It was like trying to stop a flood with a sponge. The early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic were a cocktail of fear, misinformation, and social stigma, shaken with a dash of scientific guesswork. It was a time that tested the resolve of the medical community and the compassion of society. But in those murky waters, seeds of determination were planted, seeds that would eventually grow into a global movement against one of the deadliest epidemics of modern times. In the chaos of the early 1980s, it was easy to feel like humanity was up against an unbeatable foe. But as history would show, this was just the beginning of a long, arduous fight. The fight against HIV/AIDS would prove to be a battle not just against a virus, but against ignorance and fear, and it was a battle that humanity could not afford to lose. As the early 1980s trundled along, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was about to collide with the cultural landscape like a wrecking ball in a Tudor. The decade of shoulder pads and synth-pop was also a time when misinformation spread like butter on hot toast, and the social and political climate didn't exactly help matters. It was an era of big hair and even bigger stigmas, where the media's sensationalist tendencies were rivaled only by their love for catchy, yet misleading, headlines, until the Reagan administration, which approached the epidemic with all the urgency of a sloth on a lazy afternoon. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, was more focused on fighting the Cold War and lowering taxes than tackling this mysterious new disease. In fact, it took him until 1985 to even utter the word AIDS publicly, by which time over 5,000 Americans had already succumbed to the disease. Talk about being late to the party. Let's dive into the media's role in this debacle, because oh boy, did they have a field day. The press coverage of HIV/AIDS in the 1980 was a masterclass in sensationalism. They slapped the disease with labels like gay plague, which not only misrepresented the facts, but also fueled the fires of homophobia. This was a time when the term fake news wasn't yet a Twitter staple, but misinformation was as rampant as a tabloid headline. The media, in its quest for catchy titles, often overlooked the nuances and complexities of the epidemic, reducing it to sound bites and scare tactics. In this atmosphere of fear and ignorance, stigmatization of affected communities reached fever pitch. The LGBTQ+ community, already fighting for basic human rights, found themselves further marginalized and vilified. The disease was wrongly perceived as only affecting gay men, which led to a dangerous sense of invulnerability among other groups. After all, human nature is such that if people believe they are immune to danger, they'll act like it's someone else's problem. This false sense of security was shattered as cases began to emerge among heterosexuals and intravenous drug users. But by then, the stigma had taken root like a particularly stubborn weed. The economic realities of the 1980 also played a role in shaping the response to the epidemic. Healthcare systems were unprepared for the influx of patients requiring long-term treatment. The cost of caring for an AIDS patient in the 1980 could easily run into tens of thousands of dollars per year, a price tag that was out of reach for many. Health insurance companies were often reluctant to cover these expenses, leaving patients and their families to shoulder the financial burden. It was a perfect storm of social stigma, economic hardship, and political inaction. Meanwhile, misinformation was spreading faster than a cat video on the internet. Myths about how HIV/AIDS was transmitted were rampant, with some people convinced you could catch it from a handshake or a toilet seat. Public health campaigns struggled to keep pace with the rumor mill, and early attempts at education were about as effective as trying to catch rain with a sieve. This was a time when people were more likely to believe a conspiracy theory than a scientific explanation, a trend that, unfortunately, has persisted into modern times. In the midst of this chaos, activists began to rise up and demand action. Organizations like ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, emerged, bringing a much-needed sense of urgency and anger to the fight against AIDS. They called for increased funding for research, better access to treatment, and an end to the stigma surrounding the disease. Their motto, "Silence equals death," was a stark reminder that inaction was not an option. These activists, armed with nothing more than determination and a flair for dramatic demonstrations, managed to shake the establishment into action, or at least into paying attention. The Reagan administration, with its initial reluctance to address the crisis, eventually began to allocate more resources towards research and education. But it was a slow and often frustrating process. In 1983, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, received a paltry $44 million for AIDS research, a figure dwarfed by the billions being spent on defense. It wasn't until the late 1980 that funding began to increase significantly, thanks in large part to the relentless pressure from activists and public health officials. Despite the slow response, scientific research was making strides. In 1984, Dr. Robert Gallo and Dr. Luc Montagnier independently identified the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, as the cause of AIDS, a breakthrough that paved the way for the development of diagnostic tests and eventually treatments. It was a ray of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, progress was possible. As the decade progressed, the epidemic continued to spread, reaching pandemic proportions by the late 1980. By 1989, the World Health Organization, WHO, estimated that between 5 and 10 million people worldwide were living with HIV. The disease was no longer seen as just a problem for the LGBTQ+ community or drug users. It was a global crisis, that required a coordinated international response. The 1980 were a time of cultural upheaval, and the HIV/AIDS epidemic was at the center of it all. It was a decade that exposed the deep-seated prejudices and inequalities in society, while also highlighting the power of activism and the importance of scientific research. The story of HIV/AIDS in the 1980 is a testament to the resilience of those affected by the disease and the determination of those who fought to bring it to the forefront of public consciousness. As we leave the 1980s behind, the stage is set for the next chapter in the fight against HIV/AIDS, a chapter that will see the development of life-saving treatments and the continued struggle for equality and justice. But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons learned from this tumultuous decade. It was a time when the world was forced to confront its prejudices and take a stand against ignorance and fear. And while the battle was far from over, the seeds of change had been sown. And so, as the 1980s grooved their way to a close, the world found itself on the brink of a new era in the fight against HIV/AIDS. The decade had been a wild ride, full of more ups and downs than a roller coaster designed by a particularly sadistic engineer. But as we rolled into the late 80s and 90s, our story took a decidedly science-wide twist. Researchers, against a backdrop of government foot-dragging that could have won Olympic gold, were ready to kick it up a notch. Let's start with a hero of epic proportions, AST, or zidovudine if you're feeling fancy. This little molecule was the first antiretroviral drug approved for the treatment of HIV, hitting the market in 1987. It was like the scientific equivalent of Indiana Jones swinging into the temple of viral doom. But as with most good stories, there was a catch. AZT was originally developed in the 1960s as a cancer treatment, but it was as effective there as a chocolate teapot. Fast forward 2 decades, and researchers at Burroughs Wellcome, now GlaxoSmithKline, dusted off the old formula, and voila, AZT was reborn as the first line of defense against HIV. The FDA approved it faster than you can say, bureaucratic miracle, a record 4 months. But hold your applause, folks. This wasn't exactly a fairy tale ending. AZT came with a price tag that could make a Wall Street banker weep, around $10,000 per year. To put that in perspective, the average American income in 1987 was about $24,000. So, unless your bank account was as padded as a 1980s shoulder pad, affording AZT was a bit like trying to buy a mansion with a jar of pennies. And let's not gloss over the side effects. Nausea, headaches, anemia that could knock you on your keister. But hey, when you're battling a virus that's rewriting your immune system like a bad editor, you take what you can get. And AZT wasn't the only player in town. Scientists were diving into the genetic pool of HIV like kids in a candy store, trying to unravel its secrets. In 1989, research teams led by Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Institutes of Health were hot on the trail of combination therapies, a strategy that would become a game changer in the years to come. But let's not pretend this was a smooth ride. Funding was tighter than a pair of skinny jeans, and researchers were often stuck in a cycle of begging for resources while trying to keep the lights on in their labs. Speaking of funding, let's have a chat about the government's role, or lack thereof. The U.S. government finally started to pump serious cash into AIDS research as the 80s turned into the 90s. In 1990, federal spending for AIDS research hit the $1 billion mark, a number that would have been impressive if the epidemic itself hadn't been ballooning like an overinflated balloon animal. Bureaucracy, with all the agility of a 3-legged tortoise, was slowly catching up to the scope of the crisis. Meanwhile, on the global stage, the World Health Organization was doing its best to coordinate international efforts. In 1990, a staggering 8 million people were estimated to be living with HIV worldwide. This was no longer just a matter of national urgency. It was a global emergency. Countries needed to unite faster than a boy band reunion tour, but political and economic challenges meant progress was often slower than molasses in a blizzard. Now, let's talk about the unsung heroes, those researchers and activists who were the real MVPs. People like Dr. Mathilde Krim, who founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR in 1985, were instrumental in raising public awareness and funds. And let's not forget the activists of ACT UP, who by the late 80s had become experts in strategic disruption. They were staging die-ins and protests with the kind of flair that would make even Broadway producers take note. Their message was clear. Complacency was not an option. As the 1990s marched on, it became clear that a combination therapy approach was the way forward. In 1995, the FDA approved a new class of drugs known as protease inhibitors. These were the heavy hitters in the fight against HIV, part of the life-saving cocktail known as highly active antiretroviral therapy, HART. The introduction of HART in 1996 was like the cavalry arriving just in the nick of time. It reduced the viral load in patients to undetectable levels, transforming HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. Cue the collective sigh of relief heard round the world. However, not all was rosy in the land of medical progress. The ethical dilemmas were as thorny as a cactus in a balloon factory. Access to these treatments was uneven at best. While patients in wealthier countries began to see improvements in health and quality of life, those in low-income nations were left to fend for themselves. This disparity was a stark reminder that when it comes to global health, the playing field is about as level as the Himalayas. By the end of the 1990s, an estimated 33 million people worldwide were living with HIV, a number that was both staggering and sobering. The epidemic was a relentless beast, but the scientific community was armed with knowledge, determination, and a growing arsenal of tools to fight back. The story of HIV/AIDS in the late 80s and 90s is a testament to human ingenuity and the power of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, as we move forward, let's not forget the lessons learned from this tumultuous period. The fight against HIV/AIDS was not just a battle against a virus, but against the barriers of ignorance, inequality, and indifference. And as the world prepared to enter the new millennium, the stage was set for the next chapter in this ongoing saga, a chapter that would continue to challenge, inspire, and ultimately transform the way we approach global health crises. As the 21st century dawned, humanity found itself caught in a tango with HIV/AIDS that was both intricate and unpredictable. The virus had spread its tendrils across the globe, not with the elegance of a waltz, but with the ferocity of a marsh pit. The international response was a patchwork quilt of denial, half measures, and occasionally flashes of brilliance. Let's take a moment to examine the global stage. In the 1990s, while countries like the United States and those in Western Europe were finally getting their act together with the advent of antiretroviral therapies, other regions were not so lucky. Sub-Saharan Africa, the epicenter of the epidemic, was home to 2/3 of all people living with HIV. With approximately 25 million infected by the year 2000, the continent faced a crisis that was as complex as it was devastating. The responses varied widely. South Africa, for example, was caught in a political whirlwind that makes a Shakespearean tragedy look like a sitcom. President Thabo Mbeki publicly questioned the link between HIV and AIDS, a stance that left scientists pulling their hair out and activists banging their heads against walls. Mbeki's government was reluctant to roll out antiretrovirals, citing concerns over their toxicity and costs, a classic case of letting perfect be the enemy of good. Meanwhile, the virus was not waiting for debates to conclude. It was busy rewriting family trees across the continent with its deadly pen. In contrast, Uganda was something of a bright spot, adopting an aggressive ABC campaign. Abstain, be faithful, use condoms. That was as simplistic as it was effective. By the mid-1990s, Uganda managed to reduce its HIV prevalence rates from a staggering 15% to around 5%. President Yoweri Museveni, unlike his South African counterpart, embraced scientific consensus and worked to dismantle the stigma surrounding the disease. His efforts were like a breath of fresh air in a room filled with the fumes of denial. But let's zoom out for a second to appreciate the economic backdrop. In countries struggling with poverty, war, and political instability, HIV/AIDS was like an unwelcome houseguest that refused to leave. The costs of antiretroviral drugs were more than just a number. They represented an insurmountable barrier for many. While Western nations had access to life-saving treatments, the financial burden left low-income countries floundering. With annual costs of treatment running upwards of $10,000 per patient, the disparity wasn't just a gap. It was a chasm as wide as the Grand Canyon. Enter international aid, a lifeline for some and a geopolitical chess piece for others. The United Nations, through UNAIDS, was established in 1996 to coordinate global efforts against the epidemic. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria was set up in 2002, and the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, followed in 2003. These initiatives were like the cavalry arriving in the nick of time, pledging billions of dollars to combat the disease. But, as with any massive influx of cash, there were strings attached. Donor countries often had their own agendas, and aid could come with caveats that made it less a gift and more a high-stakes negotiation. Let's not sugarcoat it. International aid was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided vital resources that could turn the tide of the epidemic. On the other hand, it often came with conditions that could be as restrictive as the virus itself. In some cases, funding was tied to abstinence-only education programs, which, while politically palatable to some donor countries, didn't always align with the realities on the ground. It was like trying to fix a leaky roof with a roll of duct tape, well-intentioned but ultimately inadequate. And then there was the not-so-small matter of drug patents. Pharmaceutical companies, having poured billions into research and development, weren't exactly eager to give away their secrets. The result? A battle royale over intellectual property rights that pitted profit margins against human lives. Generic drug manufacturers in countries like India began producing affordable versions of antiretrovirals, much to the chagrin of their brand-name counterparts. This was a David and Goliath story, where David had a PhD in chemistry and a factory full of generic drugs. The World Trade Organization's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, was as complex as its name suggests, attempting to balance the competing interests of pharmaceutical companies and developing nations. The Doha Declaration of 2001 was a turning point, affirming the right of countries to prioritize public health over patents in times of crisis. It was a rare victory for common sense in the tangled web of international law. Now, let's tackle the cultural factors, because what's a global crisis without a healthy dose of cultural context? In many societies, stigma clung to HIV/AIDS like a bad cologne. Misconceptions about the disease and its transmission were as widespread as they were damaging. In some places, people with HIV were shunned, ostracized, or even attacked, as if the virus itself wasn't punishment enough. Public health campaigns had to navigate a minefield of cultural taboos and misinformation, often relying on local leaders to spread the word. Because nothing says, "Listen up," like a message delivered by someone who knows the community inside and out. In places where discussing sex was as taboo as discussing politics at Thanksgiving dinner, education campaigns had to get creative. Music, theater, and other forms of entertainment were harnessed to raise awareness and change perceptions. It was a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to communicate is to entertain. By the turn of the millennium, the stage was set for a new era in the fight against HIV/AIDS. The virus, having spread its tentacles into every corner of the globe, was a constant reminder of the interconnectedness of our world. International cooperation, while fraught with challenges, was more important than ever. The story of HIV/AIDS was far from over, and as the 21st century unfolded, new chapters would be written, chapters that would continue to test the resolve of humanity and the power of science. And so, as we pause to reflect on the progress made and the challenges that remain, one thing is clear. The fight against HIV/AIDS is a marathon, not a sprint. The road ahead is long, but with determination, innovation, and a little bit of humor to lighten the load, it's a journey worth taking. As we prepare to dive into the next installment of this saga, let's remember that the story of HIV/AIDS is not just about a virus. It's about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. As the 21st century dawned, humanity found itself caught in a tango with HIV/AIDS that was both intricate and unpredictable. The virus had spread its tendrils across the globe, not with the elegance of a waltz, but with the ferocity of a marsh pit. The international response was a patchwork quilt of denial, half-measures, and occasionally flashes of brilliance. The world was marching forward, albeit with the rhythm of a toddler learning to walk, and the fight against HIV/AIDS was no different. Fast forward to the present, where the landscape of HIV/AIDS is both a testament to human ingenuity and a reminder of the hurdles that remain. Today, the epidemic is not the death sentence it once was, thanks to the wonders of antiretroviral therapy, ART. These drugs, now more affordable and accessible, have transformed HIV from a terminal illness into a chronic, manageable condition. The numbers speak volumes. Between 2010 and 2020, AIDS-related deaths dropped by 39%, a testament to the power of modern medicine and global cooperation. But hold on to your hats, folks, because the road to progress isn't all sunshine and rainbows. The introduction of pre-exposure prophylaxis, PrEP, was a game-changer, reducing the risk of contracting HIV by about 99% when taken as prescribed. It's like wearing a seatbelt for your immune system, only slightly less fashionable. Yet, the adoption of PrEP has been uneven. While it's as common in some places as avocado toast at a brunch, in others, it's about as rare as a unicorn sighting. This uneven distribution highlights a fundamental truth. Access to healthcare is still a luxury for many, not a right. And then there's the matter of stigma, the pesky social scourge that clings to HIV like cat hair on a black sweater. Despite decades of awareness campaigns, myths about HIV persist like a bad case of the hiccups. Many still believe it's a disease exclusive to certain communities, ignoring the fact that HIV doesn't discriminate. It's an equal opportunity virus. This stigma creates barriers to testing and treatment, as people fear judgment more than the disease itself. It's a tragic irony that in our hyper-connected world, misinformation still spreads faster than facts. On the research front, scientists are racing like caffeinated cheetahs to develop a vaccine and ultimately a cure. The International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, IAVI, and other organizations are working tirelessly, with promising studies showing potential paths forward. But the road to a vaccine is paved with more obstacles than a ninja warrior course. The virus's ability to mutate faster than a politician backtracking on a promise makes it a formidable foe. Still, the scientific community remains undeterred, fueled by a cocktail of optimism and stubbornness. Meanwhile, public health campaigns continue to evolve, embracing digital platforms to reach younger audiences. Social media influencers and celebrities lend their voices to the cause, using their platforms to spread awareness faster than a meme can go viral. It's a brave new world where TikTok dances are used to educate about safe sex practices, because who knew that a catchy beat could be a vehicle for public health? Economically, the fight against HIV/AIDS is a balancing act worthy of a circus performer. The cost of treatment has decreased significantly since the days of AZT's wallet-busting price tag, but funding remains a challenge. International aid, while still critical, is not the bottomless pit of resources it once seemed. Governments and organizations must be savvier than ever, finding ways to do more with less. It's a testament to human creativity that we've managed to stretch resources like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. As we stand at the crossroads of progress and possibility, it's crucial to reflect on the lessons learned. The fight against HIV/AIDS has taught us that ignorance is as deadly as any virus, that stigma can be as crippling as any symptom, and that unity is our greatest strength. It's a battle that's far from over, but the victories won so far are a beacon of hope for the future. In this era of rapid change, education and awareness remain our most potent weapons. Schools, communities, and governments must continue to champion comprehensive sex education and promote testing without judgment. Because knowledge, as they say, is power. And in this case, it's the power to save lives. The future of HIV/AIDS is unwritten, but with continued effort, it's a story that could very well end on a triumphant note. So, what's the takeaway from all this? The fight against HIV/AIDS is a marathon, not a sprint. It's a journey filled with twists, turns, and the occasional wrong turn down a one-way street. But with perseverance, innovation, and a dash of humor to keep us sane, it's a journey worth taking. As we look to the future, Let's remember that the fight is not just about a virus. It's about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. And if that's not a story worth telling, then I don't know what is. In the spirit of cheeky self-awareness, let's admit that while the path ahead is challenging, it's also a chance for redemption, a reset button for humanity's priorities. So, here's to a future where we tackle HIV/AIDS with the same zeal as finding a parking spot on Black Friday. Let's keep pushing, keep learning, and above all, keep caring. Because if there's one thing this saga has taught us, it's that when it comes to health, we're all in this together. In the grand tapestry of human history, few threads are as vibrant and tangled as the Silk Road. This ancient network of trade routes wasn't just a highway for silk and spices. It was a superhighway for ideas, cultures, and occasionally, the odd diplomatic debacle. Now, let's rewind to around 130 BCE, where our story kicks off with a cast of characters worthy of any blockbuster. Emperor Wu of Han China, a determined diplomat named Zhang Kaiyan, and of course, a caravan of camels that could give your local delivery service a run for their money. So, here's the deal. Emperor Wu wasn't just your average run-of-the-mill emperor. He was the kind of guy who looked at a map and thought, why not? Let's expand. But like any good leader, he needed intel, specifically intelligence on the mysterious lands beyond China's borders. Enter Zhang Kaiyan, a man whose travel itinerary would make a modern-day frequent flyer jealous. Tasked with a diplomatic mission to forge alliances with the distant Yuezhi people, Zhang's journey was a real-life odyssey minus the Greek gods, but with plenty of bandits, harsh terrains, and a 10-year detour due to captivity. Yeah, that's right. 10 years. Talk about taking the scenic route. Despite the unexpected pit stops, Zhang Kaiyan returned to China with tales that would spark a trade revolution. He didn't just bring back news of potential allies. He described exotic goods that made Emperor Wu's eyes light up like a kid in a candy store. Except, in this case, the candy was silk, spices, and, intriguingly, horses that could outrun the wind. These weren't just any horses. They were the so-called heavenly horses from Fergana, and they became the object of Emperor Wu's equine obsession. It wasn't long before the Silk Road was more than just a diplomatic doodle on Wu's map. It was a network of trade routes that stretched thousands of miles, from the heart of China to the bustling markets of Rome. Picture this: precious Chinese silk winding its way through the rugged mountains and endless deserts, eventually landing on the backs of Roman aristocrats who wouldn't know a loom from a lathe. The Roman elite couldn't get enough of the stuff, and they were willing to pay handsomely for it, so much so that by the time the silk reached Rome, it was worth its weight in gold, quite literally. Talk about haute couture. But silk wasn't the only game in town. The Silk Road was a veritable smorgasbord of goods. There were spices that would make a modern-day chef weep for joy, jade that sparkled like a dragon's hoard, and glassware that shimmered with the promise of 1,000 sunsets, all traversing the unforgiving terrain of Central Asia. And let's not forget the most valuable cargo of all: ideas. Religions, technologies, philosophies. These were the real treasures exchanged along the Silk Road, shaping societies in ways no one could have predicted. Of course, the romantic notion of the Silk Road as an unbroken line of bustling bazaars and peaceful caravans is mostly a myth. The reality was far grittier. Think sandstorms that could exfoliate you right down to the bone, and bandits who treated travelers like their personal ATM. Yet despite the perils, merchants braved the journey because the rewards were just too tempting. The Silk Road was less a single route and more of a network of interconnected paths, each with its own set of challenges and opportunities. So, next time you slip into a silk shirt or sprinkle a pinch of pepper on your pasta, remember the Silk Roads, ancient merchants who trudged through deserts and mountains, driven by the lure of profit and adventure. They were part of a motley crew that, without knowing it, laid the groundwork for global trade as we know it today. And while the Silk Road's golden age might be long past, its legacy lingers in every corner of our interconnected world, proof that even in ancient times, the world was a lot smaller than we might think. As the Silk Road saga unfolds, let's delve into what really made this ancient trade network tick: the economic engine and the daring merchants who fueled it. Forget the romanticized vision of a smooth journey across serene landscapes. This was more like the ultimate endurance test, complete with environmental hazards and human threats. Merchants faced staggering costs and risks, often wagering their very lives against the prospect of profit. Sandstorms. They'd strip more than just paint off your caravan. Bandits. Think of them as the original highwaymen, minus the Robin Hood charm. Merchants weren't just hauling trinkets and baubles. They were transporting goods that would make a modern-day investor's portfolio look like a garage sale. We're talking jade, glass, spices, and of course, silk, each item carrying a price tag that could make or break an empire. And break they did, if you consider the Roman Empire's financial obsession with silk. Roman aristocrats were so enamored with this luxurious fabric that by the time it reached the markets of Rome, silk was worth its weight in gold, quite literally. The Roman Senate even tried to ban silk at one point, fearing it was draining the empire's coffers faster than you can say extravagance. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before these goods could grace the backs of Roman senators or the halls of Chinese palaces, they needed to survive the gauntlet of the Silk Road. Enter the caravanserais, essentially ancient motels for weary traders and their camel convoys. These trading posts were more than just pit stops. They were bustling multicultural hubs where languages merged and cultures collided. Imagine a place where you could overhear a Parthian trader haggling in Persian over a cup of Chinese tea, while a Roman merchant tried to decipher the intricacies of the Silk Road's local lexicon. These caravanserais weren't just about rest and refreshment. They were also crucial logistics centers, offering everything from repair services to local intel on the safest routes, or the least bandit-infested ones, anyway. Speaking of bandits, dealing with them was practically an occupational hazard. Merchants had to be as savvy in negotiation as they were in trade, often paying tolls, let's call it security money, to local warlords. It was a complex system of give and take that would make a modern-day corporate merger look like child's play. Now, let's talk numbers. A typical caravan could consist of hundreds of camels, each carrying loads upwards of 500 pounds. Picture this, a single camel laden with silk, spices, or jade, trekking across thousands of miles, from the lush gardens of China to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. The journey could take years, with merchants spending entire seasons holed up in caravanserais, waiting for the right weather conditions to continue their trek. And while the silk was a big-ticket item, jade wasn't exactly a budget buy either. This green stone, prized for its beauty and believed to have protective properties, found its way into the hands of royalty and aristocrats across Asia and beyond. The Silk Road wasn't just an economic artery, it was a cultural crossroads. It was where East met West, where ideas and innovations flowed as freely as goods. This wasn't just about the exchange of material wealth. It was about the transmission of knowledge. Mathematics, astronomy, and even medical practices were among the intellectual spoils traded alongside more tangible goods. The Silk Road was less a highway and more a supercharged information superhighway, long before the internet made its debut. And yet, the romantic notion of the Silk Road as a symbol of peace and prosperity is, well, a bit of a stretch. Sure, there were moments of cultural exchange and mutual benefit, but let's not gloss over the conflicts and competition that often sparked along its routes. Empires rose and fell, in part due to their control, or lack thereof, over sections of the Silk Road. The Parthian Empire, for instance, thrived as a middleman between Rome and China, while the Han dynasty expanded its influence by securing these crucial trading routes. So, the next time you admire a piece of jade jewelry or savor the aroma of an exotic spice, remember the network of traders who braved the Silk Road's perils to bring such treasures to your doorstep. Their journeys were anything but glamorous, but their legacy is woven into the very fabric of our global culture. And while the Silk Road's heyday may be a thing of the past, its impact lingers on, a testament to the enduring human spirit of exploration and commerce. In the end, the Silk Road was a testament to humanity's unquenchable thirst for connection, knowledge, and, let's be honest, a good bargain. This was a world where risk and reward danced a complex tango, where the promise of wealth outweighed the perils of the journey. As we continue to explore its legacy, we find ourselves on a journey of our own, tracing the steps of those ancient merchants who dared to traverse the unknown one camel load at a time. But hey, that's a story for another day. Stay tuned, because the Silk Road's tale is far from over. Now, back to our regularly scheduled program. the Silk Road as a cultural and ideological blender on wheels, or more accurately on camels' hooves. Let's address the elephant, or should I say, the camel, in the room, the whole East meets West narrative. While it sounds like the ultimate cultural love story, the reality was often less about holding hands and more about holding onto your goods and your life. Sure, there were moments of genuine exchange, but many encounters were driven by necessity and survival rather than an earnest desire for cultural enrichment. Take Buddhism, for instance. This wasn't just a belief system that politely knocked on doors. It spread across the Silk Road faster than a meme on social media. By the 1st century CE, Buddhist monks were hitching rides with caravans, spreading their teachings from the Indian subcontinent to Central Asia, and eventually to China. This wasn't just a spiritual migration. It was a significant cultural payload that reshaped societies along its path. Monasteries sprouted up like ancient truck stops, offering rest and spiritual enlightenment to weary travelers. And let's not forget those massive Buddha statues carved into cliffs, ancient billboards advertising enlightenment on the road ahead. But Buddhism wasn't the only intellectual stowaway on this transcontinental journey. Scientific and technological knowledge hitched a ride, too, often with less fanfare but equal impact. For instance, papermaking, a Chinese innovation from as early as 105 CE, took a leisurely but impactful journey westward. By the 8th century, the technique reached the Islamic world during a little skirmish known as the Battle of Talas. The Arabs, ever the opportunists, nabbed some Chinese papermakers, and voila, the art of papermaking spread like wildfire. This was a game changer, folks. Suddenly, recording knowledge became a lot more efficient than chiseling it into stone tablets or scribbling on fragile papyrus. And then there's the compass, another Chinese brainchild, which eventually found its way to Europe. Imagine the navigational boost this provided. Before the compass, sailors relied on the stars to guide their way, a method that worked great unless clouds decided to crash the party. The compass revolutionized travel, both on land and sea, making long-distance trade less of a shot in the dark and more of a calculated journey. It's as if someone handed ancient traders a GPS system and said, "Here, try not to get lost." While we're talking innovation, let's not overlook the humble yet game-changing stirrup, which galloped its way into Europe and transformed cavalry warfare. This little loop of iron allowed riders to charge into battle with the kind of stability and force previously reserved for armies that could afford to glue their soldiers to their horses. The stirrup wasn't just a technological marvel. It was a social disruptor that shifted the balance of power, literally and figuratively, as it spread. But let's not get carried away with the romance of scientific wonders alone. Alongside these nuggets of knowledge, the Silk Road also facilitated the spread of more ominous cargo, disease. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the 14th century, is believed to have traveled along these same trade routes. So, while merchants were trading silk and ideas, they were also unwittingly swapping pathogens. Talk about a trade-off nobody asked for. Of course, the real unsung heroes, or perhaps the unsung opportunists, were the merchants themselves. These were folks who had to be part diplomat, part survivalist, and part economist. They navigated not just physical terrain, but also a labyrinth of political and cultural landscapes. Imagine negotiating trade deals in a dozen different languages, with a dozen different customs, in a dozen different climates. It's like playing a very high-stakes game of telephone, except if you mess up, you might lose more than just the message. And amid this smorgasbord of cultural cross-pollination, the caravanserais were the melting pots where it all came together. Picture a bustling hub of activity, where you might overhear a Greek philosopher debating with a Persian scholar, while a Chinese merchant showcases the latest in silk fashion trends. It was like an ancient TED talk, but with more haggling and fewer PowerPoint slides. Yet, beyond the exotic goods and groundbreaking ideas, the Silk Road was ultimately a testament to humanity's relentless pursuit of survival and prosperity. It was less about bridging a cultural divide and more about finding the next meal or the next market. Traders weren't just cultural ambassadors. They were pragmatists who knew that in a world fraught with uncertainty, the only constant was change, and they were ready to barter with it. So, as we continue to unravel the Silk Road's legacy, let's remember that while it is easy to romanticize the notion of East meeting West in a harmonious exchange of ideas, The truth is often more complex and less polished. The Silk Road was a tapestry of human endeavor, woven with threads of resilience, innovation, and yes, even a little bit of chaos. But hold on to your camels, because the journey's not over yet. These ancient highways still have stories to tell, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. And speaking of stories worth telling, let's dive into the political circus that was the Silk Road. If you think today's geopolitics is complicated, wait until you get a load of the 13th and 14th centuries. Picture the Pax Mongolica, a term that sounds like the Mongols were running a peaceful yoga retreat instead of a vast empire. But don't be fooled. This era was more Game of Thrones with camels than Cumbaya with caravans. Under the shrewd leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire stretched its sinewy arms across much of Asia and into Europe, covering an eye-popping 9 million square miles. That's bigger than some continents, folks. The Mongols weren't just about conquering, they were about connecting, and they knew a good trade route when they saw one. The Silk Road became their golden goose, and they were determined to keep it laying those lucrative eggs. They enforced a kind of brutal peace, ensuring safe passage for merchants by kicking bandits to the curb, sometimes literally. It was an offer you couldn't refuse, mostly because refusal wasn't on the menu. But let's not paint the Mongols as the benevolent overlords of trade. Their control was as much about taxation and surveillance as it was about protection. Think of them as the original toll collectors, except with more swords and less patience for excuses. Yet, in their own ruthless way, they fostered an era of unprecedented exchange. Imagine trying to explain the concept of free trade to a Mongol tax collector. Good luck with that. Nevertheless, their iron grip allowed knowledge and goods to flow more freely than ever before, albeit with the occasional Mongol tax seal of approval. Meanwhile, empires like the Tang and the Abbasid were busy turning the Silk Road into their own strategic chessboard. These guys weren't just trading silk and spices, they were trading secrets. The Tang dynasty, for example, mastered the art of espionage as if they were auditioning for a Cold War flick. They established a network of spies masquerading as merchants, collecting intelligence on the Sogdians and other Central Asian powers. It was less about friendly diplomatic exchanges and more about keeping tabs on potential threats or opportunities. The Abbasid Caliphate, on the other hand, was all about the soft power flex. They used the Silk Road to spread their cultural and scientific achievements, essentially flaunting their intellectual bling to impress the neighbors. Baghdad, their capital, became a vibrant hub of learning and culture, like an ancient Silicon Valley minus the tech bros. The Abbasids knew that knowledge was power, and they wielded it like a finely crafted scimitar, slicing through ignorance and fostering an era of enlightenment. But make no mistake, this was as much about maintaining influence as it was about genuine cultural exchange. Now, let's address the elephant, or the war elephant, in the room, the myth of the Silk Road as a peaceful corridor of commerce. The reality was often more akin to a medieval version of risk, with empires jockeying for control over the most lucrative segments. The Parthians, the Kushans, and later the Sassanids all played their part in this ancient power play. They knew that whoever controlled the Silk Road controlled the economic lifeline of the region. It was like monopoly, but you could literally lose your head over a bad deal. Take the constant tug-of-war between the Byzantine Empire and its various Persian rivals. They didn't just exchange goods, they exchanged blows, with the Silk Road often caught in the crossfire. This wasn't about taking a leisurely stroll through the bazaar. It was about securing strategic trade hubs and denying them to your enemies. So, while merchants might have dreamed of peaceful exchanges, the reality was often dictated by the latest skirmish or siege. It's hard to haggle over the price of silk when arrows are whizzing past your head. And let's not forget the role of the silk itself in this epic saga. This luxurious fabric wasn't just a commodity. It was a diplomatic tool. The Chinese emperors used it as both a carrot and a stick, gifting it to allies and dangling it in front of adversaries. It was the original soft power move, a way to weave alliances and bind enemies in silken threads of obligation. But behind the elegant shimmer of this prized textile lay a web of intrigue and ambition, spun tighter than any loom could manage. As we untangle the intricate threads of the Silk Road's political dynamics, it becomes clear that this was no simple highway of history. It was a battleground of ambition, a stage for the drama of empires vying for supremacy. Yet amid the chaos and conflict, there was a shared understanding that the road was a lifeline for commerce, for culture, and for control. The Silk Road was a paradox, a place where peace was enforced with an iron fist, and prosperity was as often seized as it was earned. In our next part, we'll dig deeper into these power struggles and explore how the Silk Road was more than just a route of riches. It was a canvas where empires painted their ambitions and adversities. So, hold onto your historical hats, because the Silk Road's tale is far from its final curtain call. There's more to unravel, and trust me, you won't want to miss the next chapter in this epic saga of trade, treachery, and tenacity. So, as we delve into the final stretch of the Silk Road saga, let's talk about its gradual decline, a fall from grace that rivals even the most dramatic soap opera plot twist. This ancient trade network, which once thrummed with the rhythm of camel caravans and the chatter of multicultural merchants, began to dim like a once vibrant star fading into the cosmos. But don't shed a tear just yet. The Silk Road's decline wasn't a sudden cliff dive. It was more of a slow, inevitable slide into historical obscurity, nudged along by the rise of maritime trade routes in the 15th century. Picture the scene. The age of exploration is on the horizon, and Europe is itching to bypass the overland routes controlled by mighty empires and savvy middlemen. Enter stage right, the maritime spice trade, with its promise of direct access to the exotic goods of the East. This wasn't just about finding a faster way to snag some cinnamon for your apple pie. It was about economic clout and the power to control the flow of wealth without having to grease the palms of every bandit and tax collector from Kashgar to Constantinople. The Portuguese, ever the trailblazing navigators, set their sights on the sea, seeking a path around the Horn of Africa to India and beyond. When Vasco da Gama finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, it was like discovering an ancient cheat code. Suddenly, the oceans were the new Silk Road, and it turns out that water is a lot easier on camels' feet. The trade winds were more reliable than the whims of Central Asian warlords, and the promise of maritime trade was too tantalizing to ignore. But let's not forget the Ottomans, who were having their own moment of glory. By the mid-15th century, they had captured Constantinople, effectively slamming shut the door on the overland Silk Road for European traders. This geopolitical power play made the oceanic routes even more appealing. The Ottomans weren't just building mosques and sipping strong coffee. They were reshaping the global trade map with the deftness of a master cartographer. Now, before we get too misty-eyed about the decline of our beloved Silk Road, let's dive into the legacy it left behind. This wasn't just a trade route. It was a cultural superhighway that forever changed the course of human history. The Silk Road was the original global village, long before the internet shrank the world to the size of a smartphone screen. It linked civilizations, facilitated the spread of religions like Buddhism and Islam, and helped ideas travel faster than a viral tweet. Imagine a world where the Silk Road never existed. Would Buddhism have found its way from India to China, altering the spiritual landscape of an entire continent? Would paper and gunpowder have transformed Europe, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the scientific revolutions that followed? The Silk Road was the thread that stitched these disparate cultures together, creating a tapestry of shared knowledge and mutual influence that still resonates today. Now, let's address the romanticization of the Silk Road. Modern culture loves a good legend, and the Silk Road has been painted in hues of adventure and exoticism that would make even the most vivid travelogue look drab. We imagine bustling bazaars filled with the scent of spices and the clamor of bartering voices, but the reality was often less harmonious and more hazardous. Yet, it's this very mix of peril and promise that fuels the Silk Road's enduring allure. It's the stuff epic tales are made of, a blend of danger, discovery, and the indomitable human spirit. In the grand scheme of history, the Silk Road's influence is like a shadow that stretches far beyond its original path. It laid the groundwork for globalization, showing that while borders may divide, trade has the power to unite. It's a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of bandits and bureaucrats, the quest for connection and commerce will always find a way. So, the next time you sip a cup of tea or admire a piece of silk, Spare a thought for the intrepid traders who braved deserts and mountains to deliver these treasures to your doorstep. Their journeys weren't just about profit. They were about paving the way for a world where cultures collide and collaborate. The Silk Road's tale may have reached its final chapter, but its legacy continues to write itself into the narrative of our interconnected world. And as you drift off to sleep with these stories weaving through your dreams, remember, the Silk Road was more than a route. It was a revolution in motion. If the phrase rise and shine had a medieval equivalent, it would have been something like rise and shiver, because that's how a monk's day kicked off, often before the sun had even thought about stretching its rays across the horizon. Forget about snoozing the alarm. These guys were up at around 2 a.m. Yep, you heard that right. While most of us today are in deep REM sleep, dreaming of that next episode of our favorite series, a medieval monk was crawling out of a straw mattress for a chilly morning meeting with God. Now, the Rule of St. Benedict was the ultimate life manual for these cloistered souls. Think of it as the original life coach, minus the Instagram influencer vibes. Written around 516 AD, it was a no-nonsense guide that laid out 73 chapters dictating every tiny detail of a monk's existence. From the moment they cracked open their eyes in the freezing dormitory to the time they shut them again, every minute was accounted for. No time for Netflix, no chill, just a strict regimen of prayers, work, and more prayers. The day began with vigils, a prayer session that took place in a stone chapel that was as much a heating system as a refrigerator is a sauna. These halls were echo chambers of Latin chants, where voices bounced off the walls like a Gregorian ping-pong match. If you were thinking about sneaking in a yawn, forget it. The acoustics would betray you faster than a medieval jester with a secret. Let's talk sustenance, or the lack thereof. Monks weren't exactly dining on roasted pheasant and sipping fine wines. Their diet was a lesson in asceticism. Picture this, a meager serving of coarse bread and maybe some thin broth. Meat was a luxury reserved for guests and the sick, so unless you were planning on faking a fever or hosting a noble, you were out of luck. By the way, the Rule of St. Benedict specified that monks were to eat just one main meal a day during winter and 2 during the summer. Just imagine the medieval version of intermittent fasting, minus the Instagram bragging rights. Now, you might think that joining a monastery was a ticket to spiritual enlightenment, and sure, that was part of the deal, but it was also about survival. In the Middle Ages, being one of 10 siblings wasn't a Monty Python sketch. It was a reality. Land and resources were split like a pie at a family reunion, and joining the monastery meant one less mouth to feed at home. Plus, the Black Plague was a constant party crasher. This infamous guest showed up for the first time in the 14th century and stuck around like a bad smell. Monasteries offered a semblance of safety, not just from marauding invaders, but from the invisible death knocking at the door. And let's not forget the economic side of things. Monasteries were like the medieval equivalent of Silicon Valley startups, minus the beanbags and kombucha. They were hubs of learning, landowners, and sometimes even brewers. But the monks themselves, they were the unpaid interns, working the fields, copying manuscripts, and chanting their way to heaven on a pittance. The Rule of St. Benedict stated that idleness is the enemy of the soul. So these guys were kept busy, whether it was tilling the land or illuminating manuscripts with intricate designs that would make a modern graphic designer weep with envy. In a nutshell, being a medieval monk was a mixed bag of spiritual dedication, economic necessity, and a survival tactic in a world where life was nasty, brutish, and often way too short. So the next time you hit snooze on your alarm, remember those monks who rose in the dead of night, not for a paycheck or a pat on the back, but for a higher calling, and maybe a little peace away from the family chaos. Yet, even as monks rose in the dead of night for a higher calling, they had to wrestle with the earthly demands of keeping their abbey's coffers from running drier than a desert at noon. Enter the fascinating world of monastic economics, where balancing the books was as much a spiritual act as a financial necessity. You see, while their vows of poverty might have implied living with less, the reality was that monasteries often sat on wealth that would make a medieval lord green with envy. Monasteries were like the Amazon warehouses of their time, minus the 2-day shipping. They controlled vast tracts of land, which meant they were knee-deep in agriculture and livestock. Sheep farming was a particularly lucrative gig, with wool being the medieval equivalent of liquid gold. In England, for instance, by the 12th century, some monasteries managed thousands of sheep. Fountains Abbey, one of the wealthiest in Yorkshire, was estimated to have a flock of around 15,000. That's a lot of barring and bleeding, not to mention the business of shearing, spinning, and selling the wool, which was shipped across Europe. Forget about lifestyles of the rich and famous. This was lifestyles of the woolly and wealthy. But it wasn't all pastoral perfection. Managing this kind of operation required some serious medieval project management skills. Imagine trying to coordinate sheep farming logistics without a single spreadsheet or email in sight. The monks were the original multitaskers, flipping between spiritual duties and economic enterprise like it was nobody's business. And speaking of business, let's not overlook the holy brewmasters. Yes, beer was part of their divine portfolio. Monasteries brewed beer not just for sustenance, but also as a source of income. It was safer to drink than the often questionable water, and its production required a combination of skill and patience that monks were more than equipped for. In fact, the monks of St. Gall in Switzerland were producing an impressive 1,000 litres a day by the 9th century. That's a lot of suds for both spiritual contemplation and economic gain. Now, while these monks were busy pursuing their entrepreneurial endeavours, they still had to grapple with the question of how to reconcile their burgeoning wealth with their vows of poverty. The rule of St. Benedict had some thoughts on this, emphasizing that all things should be held in common. Yet, as the abbey's coffers swelled, so did the temptation to blur the lines between necessity and luxury. It's the age-old dilemma. How do you stay true to your principles when there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? Let's not forget the scribing side hustle. Monks were the medieval world's publishers and printers, painstakingly copying manuscripts by hand. This was no small feat. Some manuscripts took months or even years to complete. Their illuminated pages were works of art, and they didn't come cheap. Wealthy patrons would pay handsomely for these manuscripts, which became both a spiritual offering and a fiscal necessity. In a way, these monks were the original influencers, their beautifully crafted books spreading the gospel, literally, while keeping the abbey's finances afloat. Yet, for all their economic savvy, monks were not immune to the politics and pressures of their time. Their vast landholdings and wealth often made them targets for both royal favor and enmity. Kings and nobles would bestow lands upon monasteries to ensure prayers for their souls, but they could also just as easily retract those gifts if the political winds changed. The monks had to navigate these treacherous waters with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, balancing the demands of their spiritual mission with the pressures of worldly power. And so, while the image of a monk might conjure thoughts of quiet contemplation and simple living, the reality was far more complex. They were spiritual warriors and economic strategists, walking a fine line between heaven and earth. Their lives were a study in contrasts, where the sacred and the secular collided in a daily dance of devotion and duty. As we continue to peel back the layers of monastic life, it's clear that these men of the cloth were not just praying for their daily bread. They were kneading the dough, too. While the monks balanced their spiritual lives and economic endeavors, the social dynamics inside the monastery were far from a serene conveyor circle. Instead, these cloisters could rival any medieval court in terms of drama, intrigue, and the occasional power grab. Let's dive into the world behind those thick stone walls, where silence was golden, except when it wasn't. First, let's talk about the vow of silence. Many assume it was all about monks wandering around in a tranquil hush, but the reality was a tad more complex. Silence was indeed enforced in certain areas, like the church and the refectory, but outside of these zones, speech was not only allowed but essential. After all, someone had to coordinate the sheep herding and beer brewing. This wasn't just a spiritual exercise, it was also a practical matter. A monk's life was busy, and they needed to communicate to keep the monastery running smoothly. But when they did speak, it wasn't for idle chatter. Conversations were likely to be as efficient as a medieval project management meeting, minus the PowerPoint. Now, monasteries were not just spiritual havens, they were also hotbeds of political wrangling. The abbot, the head honcho of the monastery, wielded considerable power, and with power came politics. Election to this position was no mere rite of passage. It was a contest that could rival any Game of Thrones plotline. Candidates needed the support of their fellow monks, which wasn't always guaranteed. These elections could be as contentious as any medieval coronation, complete with alliances, betrayals, and the occasional scandal. Imagine a medieval version of House of Cards, but with more chanting and fewer tailored suits. Inside the monastery, the hierarchy was as rigid as a knight in full armor. At the top was the abbot, followed by the prior, sub-prior, and then the rank-and-file monks. Each position came with its own set of responsibilities and privileges. The abbot had the final say on everything from financial decisions to spiritual matters, making them a key player in both the religious and economic life of the community. But like any leader with a taste for power, some abbots were tempted to indulge in the finer things, blurring the lines of their vows of poverty. A little too much fine wine here, an extra helping of roast meat there. Speaking of indulgence, not all monks were cut from the same ascetic cloth. While some adhered strictly to the rule of Saint Benedict, others found creative ways to bend the rules. For instance, the prohibition against eating meat applied primarily to four-legged animals. So what did some clever monks do? They classified beavers as fish. Yes, you heard that right. Beavers were on the menu, proving that even in medieval monasteries, where there was a will, there was a loophole. But let's not forget the monastery's role as the medieval equivalent of a startup incubator for scribes and scholars. These places were buzzing with intellectual activity long before Silicon Valley was a twinkle in California's eye. Monasteries were centers of learning, preserving and copying ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost to the ravages of time. In fact, during the Carolingian Renaissance, in the 8th and 9th centuries, monasteries became the intellectual powerhouses of Europe, keeping the light of knowledge burning through the darkest times. The scribes, hunched over their desks, painstakingly copied texts by hand, a laborious process that took weeks, months, or even years, depending on the complexity of the manuscript. They used quills made from bird feathers and ink concocted from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. It was an art form, requiring precision and patience, and the results were nothing short of stunning. Illuminated manuscripts, with their vibrant colors and intricate designs, were the medieval equivalent of a well-curated Instagram feed, each page a masterpiece designed to inspire awe and devotion. However, all this scholarly activity wasn't just for spiritual edification. It was also big business. Wealthy patrons paid handsomely for these manuscripts, which served as both religious texts and status symbols. An illuminated Bible could cost as much as a small farm, making them precious commodities. Monasteries thus became the nexus of a medieval knowledge economy, where the written word was both a spiritual gift and a commercial product. Yet, as monasteries amassed wealth and influence, they also attracted their fair share of envy and animosity. Kings and nobles might bestow lands and funds in exchange for prayers, but they could also retract these gifts, leaving monasteries in precarious positions. The monks had to be shrewd negotiators, balancing their spiritual duties with the demands of worldly power. They were medieval diplomats, walking a tightrope between heaven and earth, ensuring their abbey's survival in a world as unstable as a wooden cart on a rocky road. So, while the image of a monk might conjure thoughts of solitary contemplation and simple living, the reality was far richer and more complex. These men of the cloth were spiritual warriors, economic strategists, and political players, navigating the turbulent waters of medieval society with a skill that would make any modern-day CEO nod in approval. As we continue to explore the multifaceted world of monastic life, it's clear that these monks were not just praying for their daily bread. They were baking it, too, and selling it for a tidy profit. While the image of monks as isolated spiritual hermits might seem appealing, like a medieval version of off-the-grid living, it's about as accurate as a knight using a fork in the 8th century. Spoiler alert, forks weren't a thing in Europe until the 11th century, and neither was true monastic seclusion. In reality, monasteries were more like bustling crossroads than tranquil getaways, with monks constantly rubbing shoulders with the outside world. They were the original urban posts, offering shelter to travelers who couldn't just book a holiday inn at the drop of a hat. Picture this, a weary traveler dragging themselves across muddy roads, eyes lighting up like a Christmas tree at the sight of a monastery. This wasn't just a spiritual pit stop. It was a medieval bed and breakfast, complete with a side of Gregorian chant. Hospitality wasn't just a nice gesture. It was a monastic duty. The rule of St. Benedict explicitly stated that all guests should be treated like Christ himself, which means that even the scruffiest of wanderers got the royal treatment. So, while you might think of monks as introverts in robes, they were actually more like the ultimate hosts, ensuring their guests left with full bellies and lighter hearts. But monasteries didn't just play host to the average Joe. They were also political hubs where important deals were struck and alliances forged. Imagine a medieval G7 summit, but with more incense and fewer photo ops. Nobles and church officials would gather in the austere halls to negotiate everything from land disputes to marriage alliances. It was a delicate dance where monks had to tread carefully, balancing their spiritual duty with the very earthly necessity of keeping the peace. And then there was the not-so-small matter of local politics. Monks were often entangled in the affairs of the nobility, whether they liked it or not. If a local lord decided he wanted a slice of the monastery's fertile lands, the monks had better have their negotiating skills sharpened to a point. It was like a chess game played on a board of rolling hills and fertile fields, with bishops and knights that could change allegiances faster than you could say, Amen. In some cases, monasteries were even called upon to mediate disputes, acting as neutral parties in a world where neutrality was about as common as a solar eclipse. This wasn't just a matter of keeping their own abbeys intact. It was also about maintaining their standing with the higher-ups in both the church and secular society. They had to play their cards right, ensuring they didn't end up on the wrong side of a power struggle that could leave them out in the cold, both literally and figuratively. But all this interaction with the outside world wasn't without its internal consequences. The pressure to maintain a good relationship with patrons and local lords often led to tensions within the monastery itself. Not every monk was thrilled about the increasing secularization that came with wealth and influence. Some longed for a return to the simpler, more ascetic roots of monastic life, leading to what you might call an ecclesiastical identity crisis. These internal rebellions were like early office politics, complete with factions and whispered conversations in the cloisters. The Cluniac reforms of the 10th century were one such internal uprising, a reaction against what many saw as the laxity and corruption that wealth had brought. The Cluniacs sought to reinvigorate monastic life with stricter adherence to the rule of St. Benedict, emphasizing spiritual purity over material wealth. It was a call to arms, or rather, a call to prayer, against the creeping tide of secular influence. These reforms spread across Europe like wildfire, reshaping the landscape of monastic life and proving that monks were as capable of internal revolution as they were of external diplomacy. And let's not forget the ever-looming threat of external rebellions. Monasteries might have been spiritual sanctuaries, but they were also prime targets for those looking to make a quick buck or settle a score. Viking raids, for instance, were a terrifying reality for many coastal monasteries in the 9th and 10th centuries. The monks of Lindisfarne in 793 AD found this out the hard way when Norsemen descended upon them like a storm on a summer's day, leaving behind a scene more suited to an epic saga than a peaceful retreat. These attacks weren't just about looting. They were power plays in the ongoing struggle for dominance over Europe's fragmented kingdoms. Monasteries, with their wealth and strategic locations, were caught in the crossfire. It was a harsh reminder that while monks might retreat behind stone walls to escape the world had a way of kicking down those walls with little regard for sacred spaces. Of course, not all interactions with the outside world were violent or politically charged. Some were downright enlightening. Monasteries were often the sole repositories of knowledge, preserving ancient texts and advancing learning during times when the rest of Europe was just trying to survive. They were the libraries of their day, open to scholars and students eager to learn about everything from theology to astronomy. This exchange of ideas was a beacon of light in the otherwise dark and tumultuous medieval world. So, while the romantic notion of a monk as a solitary figure lost in contemplation is appealing, the reality was much more complex. They were engaged in a constant balancing act, navigating the pressures of the outside world while trying to maintain their spiritual integrity. It was a juggling act that required them to be diplomats, hosts, and sometimes even warriors. all while remaining focused on their higher calling. As they opened their doors to the world, they also opened themselves to its challenges, proving that even the most secluded lives are shaped by the world outside. Yet, even as these monks navigated the tightrope between spiritual devotion and worldly engagement, their impact stretched far beyond the cloistered walls of their abbeys. You see, these robed multitaskers were not just about the chanting and brewing, though let's be honest, those were pretty impressive too. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of European culture, from the illuminated manuscripts that gleam like medieval Instagram posts to the brewing techniques that would make any hipster barista nod in approval. First up, let's dive into the world of knowledge preservation. While the rest of Europe was busy dodging plagues and Viking raids, monks were huddled over their desks, quills in hand, scribbling away like the original data entry specialists. The libraries of monasteries, brimming with Latin texts and ancient wisdom, were the Wi-Fi networks of their day, except with a lot more parchment and a lot less buffering. It was here that the works of Aristotle, Cicero, and Euclid were painstakingly copied and illuminated, ensuring that the intellectual light of antiquity wasn't snuffed out by the Dark Ages. And let's not underestimate the power of those lavishly decorated manuscripts. Imagine the dedication. Months, sometimes years, spent on a single book, each page a masterpiece of calligraphy and illustration. The Lindisfarne Gospels, an 8th century gem, is a prime example, its pages bursting with intricate knotwork and vibrant colors. These illuminated manuscripts not only preserved texts, but also served as visual sermons, preaching to the eyes as much as to the soul. They were the medieval equivalent of a TED talk, a fusion of art and intellect, designed to captivate and educate. Now, while monks were busy turning parchment into works of art, they were also laying the foundations of Europe's educational future. Many monasteries had attached schools, the medieval answer to the question, where do I learn Latin if I'm not royalty? Here, boys from all walks of life, well, mostly the sons of nobility and wealthy merchants, were educated in reading, writing, and a smattering of arithmetic. Think of it as Hogwarts minus the magic, and with a lot more Latin conjugations. These monastic schools were the seeds from which medieval universities would eventually sprout. The University of Paris, for instance, owes much to the scholastic tradition nurtured by monastic scholars. By the 12th century, this budding institution had transformed into a hub of intellectual inquiry, attracting students from across Europe like moths to an academic flame. So the next time you grumble about student loans, spare a thought for the monks who laid the groundwork for higher education. No tuition fees, but plenty of chanting. Of course, no discussion of monastic influence would be complete without a nod to their economic endeavors. These guys were the medieval equivalent of venture capitalists, albeit with a vow of poverty instead of a stock portfolio. Their agricultural innovations, like advanced crop rotation and sheep farming, turned monasteries into agricultural powerhouses. By the 12th century, the Cistercians, a particularly industrious monastic order, had perfected the art of sheep farming, producing high-quality wool that was the medieval equivalent of cashmere. And if you're wondering about the beer, because who isn't, monks were the original craft brewers. The Trappists, a branch of the Cistercian order, are still renowned today for their beer, which boasts a flavor profile as complex as a medieval manuscript. Monasteries brewed beer both for their own sustenance and as a means of income, contributing to the local economy while ensuring their own survival. Their brewing techniques, honed over centuries, have left a lasting legacy that continues to quench the thirst of modern beer aficionados. Yet, for all their contributions to economic prosperity and education, the monks' influence also extended to shaping the cultural landscape of Europe. Through their relentless copying and preservation of texts, they helped fuel the Renaissance, that grand revival of art and learning that swept across the continent like a breath of fresh air. Without the monks' efforts, many of the classical texts that inspired Renaissance thinkers might have been lost to the ravages of time, leaving Europe a poorer place, both intellectually and culturally. But why, after all the hardships and austere living conditions, does the monastic life still hold a certain allure for modern minds? Perhaps it's the appeal of simplicity in a world that's become overwhelmingly complex. The idea of retreating from the chaos, focusing on inner peace and living a life of purpose, resonates with many today. And let's not forget the communal aspect. Living in a supportive environment where everyone contributes to the common good has a certain charm, especially when contrasted with the isolating hustle of modern life. And yes, there's the beer. In an age where craft brews are all the rage, the monk's legacy as master brewers adds a layer of earthy appeal to the modern lifestyle. The thought of sipping a finely crafted ale, brewed with centuries of tradition, connects us to a rich history that's as intoxicating as the drink itself. In the end, the legacy of medieval monks is a tapestry of spiritual devotion, economic innovation, and cultural preservation. They were not just men of prayer, but architects of a future they might never have imagined, one where their influence continues to echo in university lecture halls, craft breweries, and the quiet corners of libraries. These monks were the unsung heroes of the medieval world, their lives a testament to the power of knowledge and the enduring spirit of human curiosity. So the next time you raise a glass of Trappist ale, remember the monks who, through their quiet dedication, helped shape the world as we know it. Cheers to them, and to the enduring legacy they left behind, a legacy that reminds us that even in the darkest times, light can be found in the most unexpected places. You're 7 years old, and guess what? It's time to pack up that childhood innocence and trade it in for a one-way ticket to Sparta's legendary agoge. Yep, you heard that right. At an age when kids today are tangled up with Lego sets, you're being handed over to the state for some good old-fashioned military training. Forget the warmth of home-cooked meals and bedtime stories. Your new life involves a lot of shouting, running, and surprise, surprise, black broth. If you've ever heard about Spartan discipline and thought, hey, that sounds kind of cool, it's time to separate the legend from the less glamorous truth. The agoge was not some summer camp for budding warriors. Nope, it was a full-on, state-sponsored military school where boys were groomed to become the ultimate Spartan soldiers. It started at age 7 and didn't let up until you hit your late teens. Here's the kicker. This program wasn't about nurturing your delicate childhood dreams. It was about survival of the fittest, quite literally. The first lesson, endurance. You better get used to it because comfort is not on the curriculum. Now, let's talk training. It wasn't just about lifting weights and running laps. We're talking about an all-encompassing education in war, survival, and cunning. Think of it as a brutal boot camp that lasted a decade. The instructors, they weren't your friendly neighborhood teachers. They were seasoned soldiers who believed that discipline was best administered with a heavy hand. Punishments were harsh, slack off, and you'd learn the hard way. The agoge was the ultimate proving ground, and you were expected to emerge tougher, faster, and smarter, or not at all. But what about the infamous Spartan diet? Ah, the black broth. A concoction so notorious it could probably make even the most adventurous foodie cringe. Made from pig's blood, salt, vinegar, and a few other unappetizing ingredients, this was not your grandma's stew. Still, it was considered a staple for building that legendary Spartan endurance. The idea was simple. If you could stomach this stuff, you could handle anything. While other Greek states might have indulged in a bit more culinary flair, Spartans dined with practicality in mind. You won't find any elaborate banquets here, just the bare essentials to keep you marching. Of course, the reality of the agoge wasn't exactly as heroic as the myths would have you believe. Romantic tales of young boys transforming into invincible warriors are just that, tales. The truth was often brutal and unforgiving. Many didn't make it through the training, succumbing to the harsh conditions or failing to meet the rigorous standards. The agoge was a relentless filter, weeding out those who couldn't hack it. The stakes were high, and failure often meant disgrace or worse. One of the most fascinating aspects of Spartan society was its obsession with military perfection. This wasn't just about creating soldiers. It was about forging a society that valued strength, discipline, and resilience above all else. But why such an extreme approach? Well, Sparta was a small city-state surrounded by potential enemies and reliant on a large population of enslaved people, the Helots, to sustain its economy. Military prowess wasn't just a cultural quirk. It was a necessity for survival. Despite the harsh realities, there was a certain allure to the Spartan way of life. The legends of Spartan warriors and their indomitable spirit have inspired countless generations. But let's not get carried away by the romance of it all. The agoge was a grueling, often dehumanizing process. It was about stripping away individuality and fostering a collective identity focused on the greater good, or at least what the Spartan state defined as such. Primary sources like Plutarch give us glimpses into this world, though their accounts are often tinged with a bit of admiration for the so-called Spartan mirage. Plutarch tells us, the boys were taught to endure pain and to show no sign of suffering. Notice the emphasis on stoicism and endurance. It's like a centuries-old version of no pain, no gain, but with far higher stakes. So, as you sit there, pondering the life of a Spartan youth, remember that behind the glamour of those stories lies a reality that was often grim and unforgiving. The agoge wasn't about nurturing young minds. It was about molding warriors through a process that was as much about breaking spirits as it was about building them. And while the world continues to be fascinated by the Spartans, it's worth remembering that their path to glory was paved with sacrifice, hardship, and a relentless pursuit of military supremacy. Now, let's dive into the shadowy underbelly of Spartan society, where things get a little more sinister. Enter the Crypteia, the ancient world's version of a secret police force. You might think of it as a boys' night out with a dark twist, where the stakes were life and death. Unlike the agoge, which at least had the pretext of education, the Crypteia was about control, specifically keeping the Helot population in check. These weren't just covert arps. This was state-sponsored terror with a mission to maintain the Spartan social order. The Helots, for those just tuning in, were the enslaved population in Sparta, primarily made up of the conquered Messenians. They outnumbered the Spartans by a ratio of about 7-1. And let's be blunt, Spartans were more terrified of these subjugated neighbors than any foreign army. The Crypteia was the answer to that fear, a grim reminder of who held the real power. Young Spartan men, who had just emerged from the rigors of the agoge, weren't handed diplomas. They were handed daggers and told, go prove you're a Spartan. So, what exactly did this mean for a Spartan youth embarking on this eerie rite of passage? It meant being sent into the countryside armed with little more than a cloak and a knife. The task, to terrorize the Helots, often with lethal consequences. Picture it as a twisted scavenger hunt, where the treasure wasn't gold, but rather the preservation of Spartan supremacy. The Crypteia operated under the cover of night, a literal cloak and dagger affair, aimed at instilling fear and reminding the Helots of their precarious place in the world. Now, before you start imagining this as some sort of ancient dystopian novel, remember that these missions were very real and had practical purposes. Sparta's entire economy was built on the backs of the Helots. They farmed the land, allowing Spartans to focus entirely on military pursuits. Without the Helots, the Spartan way of life would collapse like a poorly constructed sandcastle. So, keeping the Helots subdued wasn't just a hobby. It was an economic necessity. But why such extreme measures? Well, let's consider the alternative. A Helot uprising could spell disaster. This wasn't paranoia. It was a genuine threat. The fear of a Helot revolt was as constant as the sun rising over the Taygetus mountains. The Spartans were well aware of what happened in other Greek city-states when enslaved populations revolted, and they weren't about to let that happen on their watch. The Crypteia was as much about psychological warfare as it was about physical violence, a brutal reminder to the Helots that rebellion was not an option. And what of the young Spartans themselves? The experience was a test of cunning and ruthlessness, qualities highly prized in Spartan society. It was a chance to prove oneself, not just in terms of physical prowess, but in the art of stealth and strategy. In a twisted sense, it was a capstone project for the agoge graduates, a real-world application of all that training in survival and combat. But make no mistake, these weren't heroic exploits. They were acts of oppression, and the Spartans were well aware of the moral complexities, even if they didn't lose much sleep over them. The Crypteia, while a chilling institution, also gives us a window into the economic realities of ancient Sparta. The city-state's economy was heavily dependent on agriculture, and with the Helots doing all the hard labor, Spartans were free to perfect their military skills. This division of labor created a unique social structure, but it also laid the groundwork for a system rife with tension and oppression. The Spartan elite knew they had to keep the Helots underfoot, not just with threats and violence, but with a relentless psychological campaign. Of course, the romanticized image of the Spartans often glosses over these darker aspects. The tales of Spartan bravery and heroism have inspired countless stories, but the reality was far more complex. The cryptare wasn't a glamorous adventure. It was a grim duty, a necessary evil in maintaining the Spartan status quo. It's easy to get swept up in the legend of the Spartan warrior, but behind that legend lies a society built on the backs of an oppressed people, maintained through fear and intimidation. Despite the harshness of this system, there's an undeniable fascination with the Spartan way of life. Perhaps it's the allure of their uncompromising dedication to martial excellence, or maybe it's the stark simplicity of their societal structure. Whatever the case, it's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. The Spartans were both remarkable and ruthless, a society that valued strength and discipline above all else, even at the cost of their own humanity. As we continue to peel back the layers of Spartan society, it's important to remember that these historical realities are both complex and often uncomfortable. The cryptare was a clear manifestation of the lengths to which Sparta would go to preserve its way of life, a testament to the darker side of their legendary discipline. And while the allure of the Spartan warrior endures, it's crucial to acknowledge the brutal realities that underpinned their society. The cryptare was not just a night out for young Spartans. It was a critical component of maintaining the delicate balance of power in a world where fear was both a weapon and a shield. Yet, as we peel back the layers of Sparta's vaunted social structure, we find ourselves staring down the barrel of some serious social engineering. While the Spartan warriors were busy perfecting their six-packs and honing their spear-throwing skills, the intricate hierarchy of Spartan society was held together by more than just sheer muscle. It was like a precariously balanced Jenga tower, with each block representing a different social group: women, perioikoi, and helots, all essential, yet rigidly defined. Let's start with the women of Sparta, the so-called outliers of the ancient Greek world. Compared to their Athenian sisters, Spartan women were practically feminist icons. But before you envision them leading suffragette marches down the Eurotas River, let's pump the brakes. Spartan women had more freedom, sure, but it was less about empowerment and more about practicality. Why the extra liberties? Simple, to make sure they could birth and raise tough little Spartans. In a society obsessed with military prowess, even motherhood was a civic duty. Spartan women were encouraged to stay fit and healthy, participating in sports and exercises that would make Jane Fonda proud. They could own property and even inherit wealth, a stark contrast to the women of other Greek city-states who were about as visible in public life as ninjas. But don't mistake these rights for gender equality. Spartan women were valued not for their individuality, but for their ability to produce warriors. It's like being praised for your Instagram following, but having no say in what you post. Now, while the ladies were doing their part, the non-citizen communities were holding up their end of this militaristic utopia. Enter the perioikoi, Sparta's middle management. The term literally means dwellers around, which sounds like they were just loitering on the outskirts, but they were crucial to Spartan society. These folks didn't get the full citizen package, but they had more freedom than the helots. They were the craftsmen, traders, and generally the ones who kept the economy ticking over while the Spartans were off flexing their muscles. The perioikoi were expected to serve in the army, but they weren't part of the elite hoplite class. They could own land and engage in trade, so think of them as the blue-collar backbone of Sparta. However, they had no say in politics, no voice in the assembly, no role in decision-making. Their lives were a continuous balancing act of being indispensable yet invisible, like the roadies at a rock concert who make everything happen but never get to take a bow. Then we have the helots, the underclass that literally propped up Spartan society. These were the folks doing the grunt work, tilling the fields and ensuring the Spartan war machine was well fed. The helots were primarily descendants of conquered peoples, making them subjugated neighbors rather than imported slaves. They were the human collateral of Spartan expansionism, and their existence was a constant reminder of the price of Spartan security. Helots had a unique position. They were more than slaves, but less than free. They could marry and have families, and they even had some autonomy over their labor, but they were always under the threat of violence. The annual declaration of war against them, yes, you heard right, was Sparta's way of keeping them in perpetual fear. It was like living in a never-ending horror movie, where the threat of danger was always lurking just off-screen. The contradictions in Spartan equality were as glaring as a sunburn in the middle of a Spartan summer. While Spartan women enjoyed certain freedoms, those liberties served the state's military agenda. Meanwhile, the perioikoi and helots were essential to the Spartan economy, yet they lived under a system that denied them basic rights and subjected them to constant subjugation. Imagine being part of a society where your entire existence is defined by how well you fit into someone else's grand plan. So, what does this tell us about the legendary Spartan equality? It's a bit like claiming a really high-tech gadget is user-friendly when, in reality, only the instruction manual is written in plain English. Spartan social hierarchy was built on necessity rather than any lofty ideals of fairness or justice. It was a finely tuned machine where each part knew its place and function, and stepping out of line could mean the end of the whole delicate operation. In the grand tapestry of ancient history, Sparta stands out as a complex weave of contradictions and extremes. A society that valued strength and discipline above all else, but was built on the backs of those it deemed lesser. The allure of the Spartan way persists, perhaps because it taps into something primal, a fascination with strength, resilience, and the idea that greatness requires sacrifice. But as we dive deeper into this world, it's crucial to remember that the Spartan legend, as compelling as it is, was underpinned by a reality that was far from the romanticized tales of bravery and heroism. As we pause here, poised to delve further into the intricacies of Spartan life, it's essential to keep in mind the broader context. The Spartan story is not just about warriors and battles, but about a society that made hard choices to maintain its way of life. The social hierarchy, with its stark divisions and inherent contradictions, was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed Sparta to thrive militarily, but also created tensions that simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. In the next part of our exploration, we'll continue to unravel the complexities of Spartan society, examining how these social dynamics played out in their interactions with other Greek city-states and beyond. We'll see how the Spartans' approach to life and governance influenced their relationships with allies and enemies alike, and how their legacy continues to captivate our imaginations today. So buckle up, because the Spartan journey is far from over, and there's plenty more to discover in this land of warriors, strategists, and reluctant peacemakers. And speaking of intricacies, let's dive into the convoluted, yet surprisingly effective political system of Sparta. Imagine a political structure that's part Game of Thrones, part boardroom drama, and part municipal council meeting. Sounds chaotic, right? Welcome to Sparta, where the governance structure was a bizarre cocktail of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. It was a political hydra, with multiple heads keeping everything in balance, or at least trying to. First up, let's talk about the dual kingship. That's right, Sparta didn't have just one king, but two. Double the crowns, double the drama. These kings came from two different royal families, the Agids and the Eurypontids, supposedly descendants of Heracles himself. Sounds grand, but in reality, this dual kingship was less about divine lineage and more about playing a careful game of checks and balances. Each king had his own responsibilities. One might be off leading the troops in battle, while the other stayed home to keep the peace. It's like having two CEOs for one company, each trying not to trip over the other's toga. Now, you might think having two kings would lead to constant power struggles, like a never-ending episode of a Spartan soap opera. Here's the twist. The king's powers were far from limitless. They were more like figureheads with swords, ceremonial leaders with a few perks, such as leading armies and performing certain religious rites. Actual decision-making, that was often left to other branches of Spartan government, like the Gerousia and the Ephors. Enter the Gerousia, Sparta's version of a council of elders. This elite group consisted of 28 men over the age of 60, handpicked for their wisdom, and, let's be honest, their ability to survive that long in Sparta's harsh world. This council was like a blend of the U.S. Senate and a senior citizens club, wielding enormous influence over Spartan policy. They proposed laws, deliberated over important matters, and even served as a high court for serious offenses. Think of them as the wise old owls of Sparta, though their wisdom was sometimes as rigid as a Spartan shield. The Gerousia was a critical component of the Spartan political machine, providing stability and continuity. These elders weren't just there to reminisce about the good old days. They were the gatekeepers of Spartan tradition, ensuring that the state didn't stray too far from its austere roots. But with great age comes great responsibility, and sometimes great stubbornness. Their focus on maintaining the status quo often meant that innovation was met with skepticism. A rapidly changing world, this could be both a blessing and a curse. Now, let's talk about the Ephors, the real power players in Spartan politics. This board of 5 elected officials was the ultimate counterbalance to the kings and the Gerousia. They had the authority to oversee the daily affairs of the state, manage foreign policy, and even put the kings on trial if necessary. Imagine being able to call a timeout on a king's reign. Now that's power. The Ephors were elected annually, making them the closest thing to a democratic element in Spartan governance, though their election was limited to the full citizens, the Spartiates. The Ephors were the embodiment of Sparta's love for paradoxes. They were both democratic in their election and autocratic in their rule. They could make or break laws with a single vote, and had the authority to declare war on the Helots annually, a tradition that kept the enslaved population in perpetual fear. If you're sensing a theme of control through intimidation, you're not wrong. The Ephors were like the bouncers of Sparta, ensuring that everyone stuck to the rules, and if the king stepped out of line, well, they'd find themselves in a very uncomfortable spotlight. This tripartite system of kings, Gerousia and Ephors, was designed to keep Sparta stable, a delicate balance of power where each part played its role to perfection, or chaos ensued. It's a bit like a 3-legged stool. Remove one leg, and the whole thing topples over. But while this system certainly kept Sparta steady for centuries, it also contributed to its stagnation. The obsession with maintaining the status quo meant that Sparta was often slow to adapt to new challenges or changes in the world around it. The political rigidity was mirrored in Spartan society, where innovation was often stifled. Other Greek city-states were busy building fleets, advancing in art and philosophy, and engaging in trade, while Sparta remained steadfast in its militaristic ways. This reluctance to change might have been admirable in its consistency, but it also meant that Sparta was a bit like that friend who refuses to upgrade their phone because the old one works just fine. In a world that was constantly evolving, sticking to the old ways could be as much a liability as it was a strength. But before we dismiss the Spartan political system as a relic of a bygone era, it's important to acknowledge the effectiveness of this complex web of governance. It created a society that was remarkably stable for a significant period of time, a society that punched well above its weight on the battlefield. The checks and balances, while cumbersome, ensured that no single individual or group could dominate, maintaining a delicate equilibrium that was as much about survival as it was about governance. In the grand tapestry of history, Sparta's political system stands out as a unique experiment in governance. It was a bold attempt to balance power and duty, tradition and pragmatism, strength and restraint. While other city-states embraced change and innovation, Sparta held fast to its principles, believing that its way of life was worth preserving at all costs. Whether this was an act of wisdom or folly is a matter of perspective, but one thing is certain. The Spartan political system was as complex and fascinating as the warriors it produced. As we prepare to delve further into the Spartan story, it's crucial to remember that this ancient society was not just about warriors and battles, but about a complex interplay of political, social, and economic forces. The Spartan way was a careful balancing act, where every element had its place and purpose, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of a people who were determined to define their own path, no matter the cost. And as we continue this journey, keep in mind that the Spartan legacy is not just a story of might and discipline, but of a society that dared to be different, even when the world around it was changing at a dizzying pace. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover in the next chapter of our exploration into the world of Sparta. The story of this remarkable city-state is far from over, and as we peel back the layers of history, we'll discover even more about the forces that shaped this unique society and the lasting impact it left on the world. So hold onto your helmets, because the Spartan saga continues, with twists, turns, and lessons that resonate to this day. So, let's unravel the mythic tapestry of Sparta, a city that has captured imaginations since the days when sandals were high fashion and philosophy was the ultimate dinner party conversation. The romanticized image of Sparta is that of a warrior utopia, a society where every citizen was a soldier and every soldier was a hero. But as we pull the curtain back, the reality is a little less glamorous and a lot more complex. First off, let's address the elephant in the room, or in this case, the hoplite in the phalanx, the so-called noble Spartan. The idea of the noble Spartan warrior is as enduring as it is misleading. Sure, the Spartans were fierce fighters, but their military prowess came at a staggering cost. For starters, their entire society was essentially a war machine, with every cog and wheel designed to support the battlefield. This singular focus on military excellence meant that other aspects of life, like art, philosophy, and economic innovation, were left by the wayside. While Athens was busy inventing democracy and building the Parthenon, Sparta was focused on perfecting the art of war. The Spartan laws were strict, and for good reason, at least from their perspective. The agoge, that infamous training ground for young Spartan boys, wasn't just about creating soldiers. It was about instilling a rigid sense of discipline and conformity, necessary for maintaining control over a society that was constantly under threat, both from external enemies and from within. The Helots, remember them. They were the subjugated class that did all the heavy lifting, both literally and metaphorically. Without the Helots, the Spartans would have had to, perish the thought, farm their own land and produce their own goods. Gasp. But this reliance on an oppressed underclass was a double-edged sword. While it allowed the Spartans to focus on military endeavors, it also created a society that was inherently unstable. The constant fear of a Helot uprising meant that Sparta had to dedicate significant resources to keeping the Helots in check, which in turn limited their ability to engage with the wider Greek world. Imagine trying to throw a party while simultaneously making sure your basement isn't flooding. It's a tough balance to strike. This focus on military might and internal control also meant that Sparta was slow to adapt to changing circumstances. While other Greek city-states were experimenting with new forms of governance, engaging in trade, and expanding their influence, Sparta remained stubbornly insular. Their political system, with its dual kingship, council of elders, and powerful ephors, was designed to maintain the status quo. Innovation was not only discouraged, it was seen as a threat. In a world that was rapidly evolving, Sparta's rigid adherence to tradition left them at a disadvantage. The consequences of this inflexibility became starkly apparent during the later stages of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta might have triumphed over Athens, but the victory was a Pyrrhic one. The constant warfare had drained Sparta's resources, and the rigid social structure that had once been their strength became a significant weakness. The system that had produced the legendary Spartan warriors could not adapt to the new realities of a post-war world, where economic power and political alliances were becoming just as important as military strength. And let's not forget the economic realities that played a pivotal role in Sparta's decline. The Spartans had little interest in trade or wealth accumulation, which might sound noble, but in a world where money was starting to talk louder than spears, was a recipe for disaster. While other city-states were minting coins and building trade networks, Sparta was stuck in an economic time warp, relying on a barter system and the labor of the Helots to keep their society afloat. In the end, the very laws that had once made Sparta a formidable power also sowed the seeds of its decline. By focusing so intensely on military prowess and internal stability, Sparta failed to adapt to the changing world around them. The romantic image of the Spartan warrior, stoic, disciplined, unbeatable, belies the harsh realities of a society that was ultimately unsustainable. The noble Spartan, it turns out, was a product of a deeply flawed system that could not endure the test of time. So, what can we learn from the Spartan legacy? For one, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of inflexibility and the pitfalls of a society that prioritizes one aspect of life to the exclusion of all else. Sparta's decline serves as a reminder that strength without adaptability is a brittle thing, easily shattered when the winds of change blow too hard. It's a lesson in the importance of balance, of understanding that true greatness comes not from the sword alone, but from a society that values diverse contributions and can adapt to new challenges. Yet, despite their ultimate decline, the Spartans continue to captivate our imaginations. Perhaps it's the allure of their uncompromising dedication to martial excellence or the stark simplicity of their way of life. Whatever the case, The Spartan story is a testament to the complexities of human history, where the line between heroism and hubris is often blurred, and where the past echoes with lessons for the present. As we wrap up our journey through the world of ancient Sparta, it's important to recognize the dual nature of their legacy. On one hand, they were a society that achieved remarkable feats, producing warriors whose legend endures to this day. On the other hand, they were a society that ultimately failed to adapt, undone by the very laws and structures that once made them great. It's a story of triumph and tragedy, of a people who dared to carve out a unique path in the world, even as that path led them to an inevitable decline. So, the next time you hear someone waxing poetic about the glory of Sparta, remember that behind the legend lies a reality far more complex and nuanced than the tales of heroism and might. The Spartans were remarkable, certainly, but their story is also a reminder that even the mightiest of societies are vulnerable to the forces of change. In the end, the legacy of Sparta is not just about warriors and battles, but about the enduring human struggle to balance strength with adaptability, tradition with innovation, and power with responsibility. And perhaps, in that struggle, we can find lessons that resonate far beyond the ancient world.